Welcome everyone to the Appalachian Oddities Iceberg. Today we'll be talking about the many oddities of the Appalachian region, ranging from things like a town burning from below to the more obscure things like a Cherokee legend of a hidden lake said to be a healing sanctuary for wildlife. That's just two of the 100 plus entries we'll be getting into in this video. And just before we begin, if you like this kind of content, make sure to consider liking and subscribing. It helps out a lot. So without further ado, let's get straight into the video with the first entry. Mothman of Point Pleasant. The legend of the Mothman of Point Pleasant all began in November of 1966 when two young couples driving near an abandoned National Guard armory outside of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, spotted something standing 6 to 7 feet tall with a 10-foot wingspan and glowing red eyes. They proceeded to speed off toward town while the creature followed, reportedly keeping pace even as the car reached 100 miles per hour. Then, over the next 13 months, Point Pleasant logged close to 100 reported sightings. A wildlife biologist from West Virginia University attributed the sightings to a sandhill crane, a large bird nearly as tall as a man with reddish coloring around its eyes, possibly wandered out of its migration route. Some push that further, suggesting the bird may have been physically altered by chemical runoff from a nearby World War II munitions plant. Then, on December 15, 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed during rush hour and 46 people lost their lives. Witnesses claimed to have seen the Mothman near the bridge that same day, and after the collapse, the sightings stopped almost entirely. Bigfoot in Appalachia. Bigfoot goes by a lot of names depending on where you are in Appalachia. In Virginia, they call it the wood booger, in West Virginia, the old man of the mountain, and in Kentucky, the hillbilly beast. The Cherokee had their own version too long before any of those names existed, a figure called Sulkalu, described as a slant-eyed giant and the great lord of the game, recorded by Europeans as early as 1823. Cherokee place names referencing Sulkalu are still scattered across western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, including one site literally called Where the Footprint Is, named for impressions found on a rock later destroyed during railroad construction. An interesting part of this entry too that I wanted to add is a Reddit post from a lifelong resident of the North Carolina mountains who describes taking his dogs out at around 11 p.m. when his golden retriever froze completely and started growling in a way he had never heard before. The second he closed his workshop door, the woods erupted with what sounded like dozens of people sprinting through the trees, branches snapping too and trunks shaking. When he went back outside with a flashlight, he said that he and the dog were surrounded by a low mumbling sound coming from every direction, close enough to almost make out words. Every time he stepped outside to check, all sound cut off instantly. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. He never found an explanation, but some commenters pointed toward Sasquatch, noting the combination of wood knocking, sudden silence, human-like vocalizations, and that specific feeling of nausea are details that come up repeatedly in similar Appalachian encounter stories. Brown Mountain Lights. In the Linville Gorge area of North Carolina, people have been reporting glowing orbs of light drifting above Brown Mountain for well over a century. The first solid traceable account appeared in the Charlotte Daily Observer in September 1913, describing a red balloon-like light that appeared repeatedly over the ridge each night. After that, a lot of explanations have been proposed and have been knocked down one after another. For example, a 1913 U.S. Geological Survey concluded that the lights were locomotive headlights, but when the tracks washed away 3 years later and the lights kept appearing, that theory was abandoned. Later investigations pointed to refracted light from nearby towns, campfires, and ball lightning. A 2010 National Geographic investigation concluded the most likely cause was gamma rays or X-rays, possibly from outer space, which arguably raises more questions than it answers. And in 1982, a Morganton resident named Tommy Hunter claimed he actually touched one of the lights at a highway overlook, describing it as feeling like sticking his finger in a light socket. 6 other people present that night corroborated his account. Cherokee legend too attributes the lights to maidens still searching the mountain for their men who died in a battle between the Cherokee and Catawba tribes around 1200 AD. Whether that account predates electrification in the area or was shaped by it is kinda hard to say. Jack Tales. Jack Tales are a cycle of folk stories centered on a single character named Jack, a poor mountain boy who gets by entirely on cleverness and luck. They trace back to the storytelling traditions of British Isles immigrants, particularly the Scots-Irish who settled throughout Appalachia in the 18th and 19th centuries. A man named Cutliffe Harmon is believed to have brought the tales over from Europe, passing them down through his family for generations before folklorist Richard Chase formally documented them in 1943. Jack succeeds not through virtue or hard work, but through wit and sheer luck, with luck winning out more often than not. He outsmarts giants, tricks the devil, and stumbles into fortune without really deserving it. The stories were never meant to be read either, passed down out loud the same way folk songs were, family to family, and in a region where that oral tradition held on far longer than anywhere else. Appalachian disappearances. The Appalachian Mountains have accumulated an unusual number of unsolved missing persons cases over the decades, concentrated along the 2,190-mile trail and within the Great Smoky Mountains. The near total absence of cell service across large stretches means that someone who steps off the trail, even briefly, can find themselves with no way to call for help, and the density of the forest makes physical searches extraordinarily difficult. Prior to the Dennis Martin case in 1969, there was no regimented or systematic approach to search and rescue in national parks. That case changed everything. A 6-year-old boy vanished in the space of a few minutes during a family camping trip, and despite the largest search in the park's history, not a single trace of him was ever found. From that case, park officials learned that more resources isn't necessarily the right answer, as the sheer number of people trampled over evidence that a more trained eye might have spotted. The procedures developed in the aftermath of his disappearance became the foundation for how national parks handle missing persons to this day. The mountains have claimed others since, and plenty of those cases remain just as unresolved. Moon-eyed people. Cherokee oral tradition describes a group of small, pale, blue-eyed people already living in the southern Appalachians when the Cherokee arrived around 1100 AD. Their eyes were so sensitive to daylight that they could only move at night, which is how they came to be called the Moon-eyed people. According to some versions of the legend, the Cherokee waged a battle against them at Fort Mountain during a full moon, when the brightness was too much for their opponents' sensitive eyes, and drove them out of the region entirely. The earliest written record dates to 1797, when a botanist documented the legend from a Cherokee intermediary. From there, settlers began attaching the story to a Welsh prince named Madoc, who allegedly sailed to the Americas in 1170 AD, and the theory spread far enough that Thomas Jefferson included instructions for Lewis and Clark to watch for evidence of Welsh-speaking Indians during their expedition. And the most often cited physical evidence is a stone wall at Fort Mountain in northern Georgia, roughly 850 feet long and still standing. Archaeologists generally describe it as a prehistoric Native American construction built somewhere between 500 and 1500 CE. Historians have also noted that the white skin detail of the legend does not appear in any documented Cherokee source before a Philadelphia author added it in 1797, following a familiar colonial pattern of suggesting a pre-indigenous European presence in the Americas. Hatfields and McCoy's feud. The Hatfield and McCoy feud played out along the Tug Fork River on the Kentucky and West Virginia border throughout the late 1800s. Popular retellings trace it back to a stolen pig or Civil War resentments, but historians point to something more practical, being land becoming more valuable as outside timber companies moved into the region, creating economic pressure between neighbors who had previously coexisted. The violence escalated in 1882 when three of Randolph McCoy's sons stabbed and shot Devil Anse Hatfield's brother Ellison during an election day brawl. Hatfield captured the three brothers and told them their fate was tied to his brothers. When Ellison died, all three were tied to pawpaw bushes and shot. The conflict eventually reached the US Supreme Court over cross-border arrests between the two states. What lingered longer than the feud itself was the image it left behind, being Appalachian people as violent and lawless, one the national press ran with eagerly and that the region spent well over a century trying to shake off. Greenbrier Ghost. In January 1897, an 11-year-old boy doing chores found Zona Heaster's shoe dead at the foot of the stairs in her West Virginia home. Her husband had already dressed her body in a high-necked gown and tied a veil under her chin before the doctor arrived, which drew little attention at the time. The doctor noted her death as heart failure but admitted he hadn't properly examined her neck. Then, within a month, Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heaster, was telling neighbors that her daughter had appeared at her bedside 4 nights in a row, describing how her husband had come home in a rage and broken her neck. Mary convinced authorities to exhume the body, and the autopsy found exactly what she described: the neck broken between the first and second vertebrae, the windpipe crushed, and finger-shaped bruises on the throat. At trial, Mary testified plainly that it was no dream. Shu's defense tried to discredit her on cross-examination, but she refused to waver, and the judge found it difficult to instruct the jury to disregard her account entirely. Shu was then convicted and died in prison 3 years later. A roadside marker in Greenbrier County still reads, the only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. Appalachian Granny Witches. Granny witches were considered the traditional healers of the Appalachian Mountains. Passed down from one generation to the next, these women used a combination of religious texts, traditional herbal medicine, and down-home remedies to treat their neighbors for a variety of complaints. For isolated mountain communities with no access to formal medicine, they were often the only option available. The first people to combine Appalachian nature and spiritual ritual were the Cherokee and Choctaw. And as European settlers moved in from Scotland and Ireland, their own folk traditions blended with that existing knowledge. Knot deer. The knot deer is a cryptid described as looking like a normal deer at first glance, but wrong in ways that are hard to put into words. Most people who report seeing one say they instinctively knew something was off before they could figure out what it was. At a distance, it passes for a whitetail completely. Those who have gone closer, however, describe eyes set forward in the skull like a predator's, joints bending the wrong direction, and movement that looks mechanical, like something that learned to walk by watching deer and didn't quite get it right. The legend is often tied to Appalachian folklore, though the name itself only gained traction online around 2018. A Tumblr user named Madison, who grew up around Boone, North Carolina, posted about it and watched it spread far beyond what she expected, though she was clear she didn't invent the idea, just put a name to something people in her circles already recognized. And the leading skeptical explanation is chronic wasting disease, a neurological disorder that causes deer to behave erratically, stumble, and lose their fear of humans. Whether it's a sick animal or something else though, the detail that keeps coming up across separate accounts is the same: it looked right until it looked at you. Devil's Tramping Ground. In the woods of Chatham County, North Carolina, about 10 miles outside of Siler City, there's a near-perfect circle of bare earth 40 feet across where nothing has grown for at least 300 years. No plant life of any kind can be found on the path itself, and locals have been unsuccessful trying to transplant even the wiry grass that grows just inside the ring to outer soils. visitors have attempted to anchor sticks and other obstacles in the barren area, but morning always finds these obstacles cleared away. Dogs brought near it yip and howl and refuse to go any closer. The local explanation is that the devil spends his nights pacing that circle, turning his mind toward ways to bring human souls to damnation, and it's the heat of his cloven hoofprints that kills the vegetation and has left the soil permanently barren. Scientists have tested the soil more than once and keep coming up empty. Results showed no copper, no high salt concentration, nothing in a high enough quantity to explain why plants won't grow there. A more recent round of testing made things stranger still. The soil inside the circle is now actually more fertile than the soil outside it, and yet nothing grows. Wampus Cat. The Wampus Cat is a half-dog, half-cat creature rumored to be seen just after dark or right before dawn throughout the Appalachians. Depending on where you are, it goes by different names: Gollywampus in Missouri, Whistling Wampus in the Ozarks, and simply Wampus in Appalachia. Descriptions consistently mention glowing green or yellow eyes and large claws, along with an ability to produce loud, scream-like howls similar to cougars. The most commonly told origin comes from Cherokee folklore, where a woman hid beneath a cougar pelt to spy on a sacred ceremony was discovered, and as punishment, the sorcerer caused the skin to become her own, turning her into a strange mix of cougar and human, cursed to wander the mountains forever alone. That said, historians note the specific Cherokee woman narrative is a modern synthesis and cannot be firmly documented before the late 20th century, drawing on genuine Cherokee practices but assembled largely through paperback folklore collections and ghost tour scripts. Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was the forced relocation of the Cherokee and several other southeastern tribes from their ancestral lands to what is now Oklahoma, brought on in part by the discovery of gold near Dahlonega, Georgia in 1828. The legal foundation it was built on was shaky from the start. The Treaty of New Echota was signed by a minority faction of Cherokee leaders without approval from the Cherokee National Council and without the signature of Principal Chief John Ross. The Cherokee then submitted a petition with thousands of signatures urging Congress to void it, and Congress ratified it anyways. When signing the treaty, Major Ridge reportedly said, "I have signed my death warrant." He was right and was ultimately assassinated alongside John Ridge and Elias Boudinot in the political turmoil that followed. More than 15,000 Cherokees were forcibly removed in 1838 and 1839, and as many as 4,000 died from disease, starvation, and exposure. Also, due to poor sanitation in the internment camps, whooping cough, measles, and dysentery were already spreading before they had even left. And not everyone made it onto the trail. Several hundred Cherokee had evaded the roundup entirely by hiding in the Great Smoky Mountains, and together with those who escaped or returned from Indian Territory, they eventually formed what is now the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, centered around present-day Cherokee, North Carolina. Bell Witch of Adams. From 1817 to 1821, a farmer named John Bell and his family along the Red River in Adams, Tennessee, came under attack by a mostly invisible entity that could reportedly speak, affect the physical environment, and shapeshift. It started with strange animals on the property, then noises inside the house, scratching in the bedposts, chains dragging across the floor, and slaps and pinches that left welts, particularly on his daughter Betsy. The entity was said to have grown more powerful over time, reportedly carrying on conversations, reciting Bible verses, and predicting the future. When it finally spoke, it called itself Kate Batts' Witch, after a real local woman rumored to have been cheated in a land deal with John Bell. The haunting was then said to have culminated when Bell was found near death, a mysterious vial of black liquid discovered near his bedside that the entity claimed she had given him. After Bell died, laughter and singing were heard at his funeral, and the haunting was said to have stopped. Tennessee is also reportedly the only state to have ever officially attributed someone's cause of death to the supernatural. Flatwoods Monster. On the evening of September 12, 1952, a group of boys playing on a schoolyard in Flatwoods, West Virginia, watched a bright object streak across the sky and appear to crash into a nearby hillside. Within an hour, they were stumbling back down that hill with their mother, a National Guardsman, and a terrified dog, claiming they had just come face to face with something 12 feet tall and not quite human. The creature was described as having a blood-red body, a green glowing spade-shaped face, clawed hands, and what looked like a dark metal dress, with an overwhelming rotten egg smell in the air that burned their eyes. Investigators eventually concluded the light in the sky was a meteor visible across 3 states, and that the creature was most likely a barn owl perched in a tree, with shadows and foliage creating the illusion of a large humanoid figure beneath it. The sighting also took place at the height of Cold War anxiety and widespread fears about secret weapons, which is considered to have likely made a streak of light in the sky and an acrid smell on a dark hillside feel considerably more alarming than they might have otherwise. Centralia. Centralia, Pennsylvania once had over 1,000 residents until a coal mine fire began below it. On May 27, 1962, the volunteer fire company set the town dump alight as they had always done before Memorial Day, and this time the fire found its way through a hole in the pit into the abandoned coal mines beneath the town. The ground grew steadily hotter, eventually reaching over 900 degrees Fahrenheit in some locations. Smoke poured from sinkholes, homes tilted, and residents reported worsening health problems that authorities were slow to take seriously. The turning point came in 1981 when a sinkhole opened beneath 12-year-old Todd Domboski's feet, 150 feet deep and searing hot. He survived only because he grabbed an exposed tree root before his cousin pulled him out. Congress appropriated $42 million to relocate residents and simply allowed the fire to burn. Also, something interesting is that the town is widely considered one of the inspirations for Silent Hill. For whoever that isn't familiar, is a horror game set in an abandoned, smoke-filled town slowly being consumed from below. But yeah, at its current rate, the fire could continue burning for another 250 years. Haint Blue. If you've ever spent any time in rural Appalachia or the South, you've probably noticed that a lot of old porch ceilings are painted a pale, washed-out blue. Most historians trace the tradition to the Gullah Geechee people, descendants of African people enslaved along the coastal low country of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, who believed in haints, being restless ghosts who remained behind to trouble the living. The color was intended either to mimic the sky, tricking the ghost into passing through, or to mimic water, which ghosts traditionally could not cross. The color was tied to indigo as well, a crop Gullah communities were forced to cultivate that already carried deep spiritual significance in West African traditions. As Gullah culture mixed with white Southern culture, the custom spread inland and became common across the region. Today, it's sold by major paint companies as a charming design choice, usually with no mention of where it actually came from. Cornstalk's Curse. In November 1777, Shawnee Chief Cornstalk arrived at Fort Randolph in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, on a diplomatic mission to warn American colonists that an attack from other tribes was coming. He and his son were detained at the fort, and when 2 soldiers were ambushed and killed by Indians outside shortly after, an angry mob of militiamen stormed the cabin where the Indians were being held and shot them all in cold blood. Legend holds that with his dying breath, Cornstalk cursed the land, and the disasters that followed kept the story alive for generations. The Silver Bridge collapsed in 1967, claiming 46 lives. A tornado tore through the area in 1944, leaving 150 dead. A plane crash in 1970 took the lives of the entire Marshall University football team, and a freight train derailment in 1978 permanently contaminated Point Pleasant's water supply. Some also connect the Mothman sightings to the curse. The problem though is that historians eventually trace the curse back to a 1921 outdoor play written about the town's history, where the writers added the dying curse themselves for dramatic effect. So there's no historical record of Cornstalk actually saying anything of the sort. Moonville Tunnel. Moonville was a small coal mining settlement in Vinton County, Ohio that peaked at around 100 residents in 1870 before disappearing entirely by the 1940s. Little remains today except a few foundation stones, a cemetery, and an abandoned railroad tunnel cut through a hillside on the old Henry Ferguson property. At least 26 deaths occurred near the tunnel over the years, largely because the town had no roads and residents had no choice but to walk the active railway tracks to reach other communities. The most well-known ghost story involves a brakeman who was drunk one night and was struck by a train while trying to signal it to stop inside the tunnel. His ghost is said to still haunt the tunnel, swinging his lantern back and forth for eternity, and in 1981, the railroad actually installed a dedicated signal light at Moonville with instructions that it alone was to be obeyed, after so many train crews over the years had made emergency stops upon seeing a lantern waving in the darkness, only to find nothing there. The line was ultimately abandoned and the rails pulled up in 1988, but the tunnel still stands. Lake Lanier disappearances. Lake Lanier is a man-made reservoir in northern Georgia built in 1956, and over 700 people have died there since, more than many lakes several times its size. A lot of that has practical explanations: heavy boat traffic, submerged debris, no lifeguards, but the history underneath adds another layer entirely. Before the lake was filled, the area was home to Oscarville, a thriving black farming community destroyed in 1912 after a white woman was found dead nearby. 3 black men were blamed, 1 was lynched, the other 2 were hanged in front of a crowd of thousands, and white mobs known as Night Riders drove nearly every black resident from Forsyth County by burning their churches and businesses. Decades later, the government flooded what remained without demolishing it first. Divers have since reported finding fully intact streets, walls, and houses at the bottom. In 1958, 2 young women skidded off a bridge crossing the lake and disappeared. It wasn't until 1990 that a submerged car was found with remains inside, solving the case over 30 years later. Locals claim one of them still wanders the bridge in the blue dress she borrowed that night. Haunted Carnton Plantation. Carnton is a plantation home built in 1826 in Franklin, Tennessee that became a field hospital after one of the bloodiest engagements of the Civil War. The Battle of Franklin lasted only 5 hours on November 30th, 1864 and produced nearly 10,000 casualties. 4 Confederate generals' bodies were laid out on the back porch afterward, surgeons amputated limbs upstairs by candlelight, and the blood soaked through the carpets and into the wooden floors, where it remains visible to this day. The hauntings reported tend to follow the history closely. The most common experiences are heavy boot-like footsteps moving through empty hallways and cold spots that refuse to leave certain rooms even in the middle of a Tennessee summer. A woman in period clothing believed to be Carrie McGavock, who maintained the Confederate cemetery on the property until her death, has been seen moving through the house, and figures have been reported standing among the gravestones before vanishing entirely. Sheepsquatch. The Sheepsquatch, also known as the White Thing, is a cryptid reported across several counties in southwestern West Virginia. It's described as roughly the size of a bear with entirely white wool-like fur, a long pointed head similar to a dog, saber-like teeth, goat-like horns, and 4 limbs that end in paw-like hands similar to a raccoon's. It's said to smell of sulfur and can move on both 2 and 4 legs. The creature was first documented by folklorist Ruth Ann Musick in her 1965 book, with the original account coming from Kanawha County, describing a woman on horseback who encountered a white beast that charged at her before retreating into the trees. Sightings surged in Boone County in the mid-1900s. In one account, a couple stopped their car after spotting a large white beast sitting in a ditch, and the creature leaped out and attacked their vehicle, leaving large scratches along the side. In another, a group of campers in Boone County claimed to have been stalked through the night, with the beast ripping through their campsite before vanishing into the darkness. Some researchers have suggested the cluster of sightings near coal mines and company towns is less about a creature and more about how residents made sense of dangerous industrial landscapes and the general uncertainty of life in the coalfields. Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Washington Irving's 1820 story The Legend of Sleepy Hollow follows Ichabod Crane, a schoolmaster in New York's Hudson Valley, who is chased one night by a headless rider hurling what appears to be a pumpkin. Irving leaves it deliberately ambiguous whether the horseman was real or just Ichabod's rival in a costume, and Ichabod is never seen again. The horseman is described as the ghost of a Hessian soldier decapitated by a cannonball at the Battle of White Plains in 1776, said to rise nightly from his grave in search of his missing head. There is actually a historical record of an anonymous Hessian soldier being decapitated during that battle, and a headless corpse was reportedly found in the area afterward and buried in an unmarked grave in the same churchyard Irving used as his setting. Whether Irving knew about it or simply drew from the long European tradition of headless rider folklore is unclear, but the real town eventually changed its name from North Tarrytown to Sleepy Hollow in 1996, leaning fully into the story. Ball lightning. Ball lightning is one of the few unexplained phenomena in atmospheric physics. It appears as a bright spherical orb of varying size, moves independently of wind or gravity, lasts anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes, and then simply vanishes, sometimes silently and sometimes with a sharp pop. Despite centuries of eyewitness accounts across the world, science still has no settled explanation for what it actually is, and the Appalachian Mountains seem to produce conditions that favor it. The region's combination of humid air, complex terrain, frequent thunderstorms, and high concentrations of quartz in the bedrock has led some researchers toward a theory called piezoelectricity, where quartz generates electrical charges under physical pressure from shifts in the earth, potentially producing spontaneous discharges even without a storm present. Daniel Caton, an astronomy professor at Appalachian State University, noted that when he read through an academic research book on ball lightning and replaced one term with another, the descriptions were essentially interchangeable with eyewitness accounts of unexplained lights in the North Carolina mountains. He attributes the majority of unusual light sightings in the region to misidentified man-made sources, but says the small percentage that can't be explained that way are probably ball lightning. As he put it, we don't know how nature makes it, but it has been documented for more than a century. John Swift's Lost Silver Mine. For more than 2 centuries, people in the central and southern Appalachians have told stories about an Englishman named Jonathan Swift who came into the Kentucky wilderness before Daniel Boone, found rich veins of silver, and left his fortune hidden in caves and crevices that no one has ever quite been able to find again. In the usual version, a wounded bear leads Swift to the ore. He and his partners smelt bars and coins in crude frontier furnaces, then he goes blind and loses the way back to his mines. The legend is based on a journal attributed to Swift, but the best known version contains portions plagiarized from a history of Kentucky written after the supposed time frame of the journal itself. No proof exists that there ever was a John or Jonathan Swift who mined silver in Kentucky, and the man many consider to be the Swift of legend was known to be alive many years after the fabled miner supposedly died. The geology also works against it. 2 centuries of subsequent mining and excavation of the area said to have contained the mine have not yielded a single vein of silver ore, yet people keep searching. Festivals in places like Campton in Wolfe County still mark the legend as part of the region's cultural identity, and every few years someone steps forward to announce they have finally located the lost silver. Kentucky's preeminent historian Thomas D. Clark ultimately concluded that Swift may have been a liar of extraordinary talent, but that his legend had been part of Kentucky folklore since 1770, and at a certain point the legend itself became the real thing. Hoop snakes. The hoop snake is a creature from Appalachian and Southern folklore, said to grasp its own tail in its jaws, form its body into a hoop, and roll after its prey at high speed. In one version, it straightens out at the last second and skewers its victim with a venomous tail stinger. The only escape is to duck behind a tree, which receives the blow instead and promptly dies from the poison. No such animal exists, but the most likely real-world source is the mud snake, a non-venomous species found in the southeastern United States that often basks in a loose coil with its tail near its head, has a sharp keeled scale at its tail tip, and presses that tip against the skin of anyone who picks it up. From a distance, especially in poor light, it's easy to see how the story grew. The earliest written account of a hoop snake dates to a colonial-era travel narrative describing the creature near the Saura towns, though the author only viewed the location after a local boy had already killed the snake. The legend spread widely across Appalachia and the rural South and even turned up in Australia, suggesting either parallel invention or how far traveling settlers carried their stories with them. Melungeons of Appalachia. In the 18th century, land surveyors in the Appalachian Mountains reported encountering bronze-skinned, light-eyed people who fell to their knees in prayer 5 times a day. The mysterious mountain dwellers, living far beyond the western border of the 13 colonies, referred to themselves as Portuguese in broken English. They were the Melungeons, a mixed ancestry community concentrated around the Tennessee-Virginia border and into Kentucky and North Carolina. Their neighbors considered them neither white, black, nor Indian, and contradictory theories about where they came from have existed for centuries, ranging from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors to survivors of the lost colony of Roanoke to early Spanish expeditions in the 1500s. The first known use of the word appears in 1813 in the minutes of a primitive Baptist church in Scott County, Virginia, where one female member accused another of harboring them. For a long time, the word was used as a slur. Many Melungeon families claimed Portuguese or Cherokee ancestry specifically as a strategy for denying African ancestry, since mixed race identity carried severe legal and social consequences in the antebellum South. DNA research published in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy ultimately found their lineage to be more African than anything else, a finding that surprised many of their own descendants who had grown up believing otherwise. Ghost train of Boston Bridge. In the early hours of August 27, 1891, passenger train number 9 on the Western North Carolina Railroad pulled into Statesville running 34 minutes late. 10 new passengers boarded before it left the station, and 5 minutes later it was gone. The train plunged off Boston Bridge, a 60-foot granite and brick span over Third Creek, killing 23 people in what remains one of the worst railroad disasters in North Carolina history. A coroner's jury concluded that someone had removed the bolts and spikes from a rail using tools left in an open shed beside the track, and that the bridge's cross tires were already unsound and should have been replaced. Nobody was ever charged. The legend that followed is specific. On each anniversary of the wreck, visitors have reported hearing screeching wheels and screaming passengers, and seeing a uniformed railroad employee holding a gold watch. The figure is said to be Hugh K. Linster, a baggage master whose body was found in the wreckage with a broken neck. On the 50th anniversary in 1941, a woman whose car had broken down nearby reported watching a train plunge off the bridge and hearing the screams of passengers, while her husband and a nearby shopkeeper found nothing in the creek below. Then on August 27, 2010, the 119th anniversary, a group of ghost hunters were on the bridge just before 3 a.m. when a real Norfolk Southern freight train came around the bend. Most ran, but a 29-year-old man was struck and killed, and a woman fell 30 feet from the bridge and was seriously injured. And the bridge is still active. Roan Mountain Balds. Roan Mountain sits on the Tennessee and North Carolina border and is home to some of the most studied and least understood features in all of Appalachia. At its summit, one peak is covered in dense spruce fir forest, while an adjacent summit is almost entirely devoid of trees, and nobody has been able to fully explain why. These open treeless summits are called balds, and they predate European settlement entirely. One leading theory is that they were created and maintained by massive prehistoric grazers like mastodons and woolly mammoths, and later kept open by elk and bison before those animals disappeared. Some Cherokee folklore suggests the ground was cursed by bloodshed from ancient battles fought on the summits. Rangers at Roan offer both explanations and lean on neither. The soil and climate conditions on the balds are not significantly different from the heavily forested slopes directly below them, which is what makes the whole thing genuinely difficult to explain. Scientists have studied them for over a century and still largely disagree. Appalachian Sky Islands. During the last ice age, red spruce and Fraser fir dominated the southern Appalachian forest, but as the climate warmed, those forests retreated north to Canada and up to the highest peaks, above 5,000 feet in elevation. Isolated from anything similar by hundreds of miles of lower terrain, these mountaintop patches became their own ecosystems, referred to as Sky Islands. Due to their elevation, these areas are home to wildlife you would expect to find much further north, along with species found nowhere else on Earth, like the spruce fir moss spider, one of the world's tiniest tarantulas, which lives only in specific moss mats on high elevation rock outcrops. From the 1880s to the 1930s, these forests were logged extensively, with catastrophic wildfires burning through the debris afterward and destroying the organic soil layer that red spruce seeds need to germinate. More than 100 years later, they still haven't recovered. The balsam woolly adelgid, a European insect introduced in 1916, reached Mount Mitchell by 1957 and eventually spread to all the southern Appalachian Sky Islands, with Fraser fir losing as much as 80% of its mature trees. As temperatures continue to rise, the species living on these peaks have nowhere higher to go. Grafton Monster. Late on the night of June 16, 1964, a reporter named Robert Cockrell was driving home along Riverside Drive in Grafton, West Virginia, when he spotted what he described as a massive pale figure, 7 to 9 feet tall, with seal-like skin and no visible head, standing near the Tigard Valley River. He floored it home, then came back with friends to investigate. They found nothing, but several of them reportedly saw something unusual near the tree line before leaving. 2 days later, Cockrell wrote up the encounter in the Grafton Sentinel, and within days, over 100 people had swarmed the area at night. Groups of teenagers armed with bats, crowbars, and flashlights were combing the riverbank. More than 20 people reported similar sightings of a tall, pale figure in the days that followed. The Sentinel then ran a follow-up piece dismissing the whole thing as spring fever and wild imagination, suggesting Cockrell had probably just seen someone pushing a handcar loaded with boxes along the road in the half-dark, which in poor light could have taken on a strange shape. No physical evidence was ever found, and no confirmed sightings have occurred since. Cockrell later corresponded privately with Gray Barker, the same West Virginia paranormal writer who had helped popularize Mothman, and the two worked on an article together that was never completed. The story largely stayed buried until the creature appeared in the 2018 video game Fallout 76, set in a fictionalized West Virginia, which introduced it to an entirely new audience. Grafton hosted its first Grafton Monster Festival in 2024, 60 years after the original sighting. The Reed Gold Mine Doorstop. In 1799, a 12-year-old boy named Conrad Reed was out fishing in Little Meadow Creek on his family's farm in Cabarrus County, North Carolina, when he spotted something shining in the water. He pulled out a wedge-shaped yellow rock roughly the size of a small flat iron, and it weighed around 17 pounds. He then brought it home to his father John, who had no idea what it was, but ultimately put it to practical use. For 3 years, it sat as a doorstop at the Reed house. Then, in 1802, a jeweler from Fayetteville identified it as a large gold nugget and told John Reed to name his price. Reed, not understanding the true value of gold, asked for $3.50, roughly a week's wages. The nugget was actually worth around $3,600. Once Reed realized what he had, things moved quickly. He formed a partnership with 3 local men who supplied equipment and enslaved workers to dig in the creek bed while Reed provided the land. Before the end of the first year, an enslaved boy named Peter unearthed a 28-pound nugget, the largest documented find in the United States. Using only pans and rockers to wash creek gravel, the part-time miners recovered an estimated $100,000 in yield by 1824, and North Carolina ultimately led the nation in gold production until it was overtaken by the California Rush in 1848. The site in Midland, North Carolina is today a National Historic Landmark, and the first documented gold discovery in the country spent 3 years holding open a farmhouse door. Haunted Natural Tunnel. Natural Tunnel in Scott County, Virginia is a massive limestone cave over 850 feet long and up to 80 feet high, carved naturally over 1 million years by an underground river. William Jennings Bryan reportedly called it the 8th wonder of the world. The South Atlantic and Ohio Railroad laid tracks through it in 1893, and it remains an active rail line to this day. The most well-known legend attached to the site involves Lover's Leap, a high pinnacle above the tunnel. According to local tradition, a Cherokee maiden and a Shawnee warrior forbidden to marry by their respective tribes jumped to their deaths from the top together. The story follows the same basic shape as Lover's Leap legends found at dozens of other sites across Appalachia, and most historians treat the pattern as a recurring piece of frontier folklore rather than a documented event at any specific location. The tunnel sits at the bottom of a deep gorge with sheer stone walls, the creek running through it, and an active Norfolk Southern freight train that still passes through without warning. Most visitors are allowed no closer than an observation platform at the entrance. One day a year, on Railroad Day, the line shuts down and people are allowed to walk the tracks through the tunnel itself, which by most accounts is a strange experience to say the least. Asa Harmon McCoy. Most of the Hatfield and McCoy families fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Asa Harmon McCoy was the exception, enlisting in the Union Army in 1863, which put him at odds with nearly everyone on both sides of the tug fork. He mustered out on December 24, 1864, and was killed just 13 days later, found shot while hiding in a cave near his home after receiving threats from the Logan Wildcats, a Confederate guerrilla group led by Devil Anse Hatfield. Devil Anse was later confirmed to have been sick at home at the time of the murder. McCoy family tradition pointed to Jim Vance, Devil Anse's uncle and a member of the Wildcats, as the one who pulled the trigger. No one was ever charged. There are no existing records pertaining to his death, and no warrants were ever issued in connection with the murder. Most historians treat the killing as a standalone event tied to Civil War tensions rather than the true start of the feud. More than a decade passed before the next serious incident between the families, a dispute over a hog in 1878, and participants on both sides later denied that Civil War differences had anything to do with the bloodshed that followed. Appalachian salamander diversity. The southern Appalachian Mountains are widely considered the salamander capital of the world, and the Great Smoky Mountains National Park alone is home to 24 species of lungless salamanders, many with ranges restricted to just a handful of nearby mountains or even a single one. Part of what makes this possible is how old these mountains are. At over 1 billion years old, they predate most of the continent's geological history, and while glaciers blanketed much of North America during the Ice Age, they never fully covered the Appalachians. While evolution was essentially reset elsewhere, the species living here just kept going, eventually diversifying into highly specialized animals. Most don't have lungs and breathe entirely through their skin, which is why the cool, damp forests, fog-covered peaks, mostly steam beds, and rotting logs work so well for them. Salamander biomass in the southern Appalachians can exceed that of all other vertebrate predators combined, with densities reaching as high as 2 salamanders per square meter. New species are still being found too, and modern DNA testing has continued to split populations that look identical into entirely separate species. The Phantom Hiker of Grandfather Mountain. Grandfather Mountain in the North Carolina high country gets its name from the mountain's profile, which from certain angles resembles the face of a bearded old man lying back against the ridge. The backcountry trails here pass through some of the most ecologically distinct terrain in the southern Appalachians, home to rare and endangered species found almost nowhere else. But for decades, hikers on those trails have reported encountering something else entirely. The figure is consistently described the same way across accounts: an older bearded man, rough-looking, wearing workman's clothes that appeared to be from somewhere around the mid-20th century, carrying a canvas army pack and a long walking stick. He appears mostly at dusk, when most day hikers have already turned back. He moves quickly, never acknowledges a greeting, never makes eye contact, and then at some point ahead on the trail, he simply isn't there anymore. No bend, no drop, no explanation. Nobody has been able to pin down who he is. Some think he was a hiker who got turned around in the backcountry, fell, and never made it out, his body still somewhere in the thick woods off the trail. Others figure he's just someone who loved the mountain and never really left. And it's said he doesn't seem to want anything from the people who see him, rather that he's just hiking. Appalachian Coal Company Towns. Throughout the late 1800s and well into the 20th century, coal companies across Appalachia built and owned entire towns surrounding their mines. Workers lived in company-owned houses, shopped at company-owned stores, and were paid not in cash but in scrip, a privately issued currency redeemable only at that specific company's store. The tokens were usually brass or nickel, embossed with the company's name and a value. A miner paid in cash could save it, spend it elsewhere, or leave. Scrip couldn't leave the camp, which is why payment in lawful money became a repeated demand in every major labor dispute across the region. Rent was deducted directly from wages, and families who opposed company policies risked eviction. Many miners were never able to fully retire their debt to the company store, leaving them in perpetual dependency. Company guards enforced order, and organizing a union could get a family evicted and blacklisted from work across the entire coalfield. The camps were almost universally remote, unhealthy, and unsafe, with frequent industrial accidents, rampant black lung disease, and poverty-driven crime. Coal scrip was deemed unconstitutional, if non-transferable, in the early 1900s, but continued to exist in Kentucky and West Virginia until officially outlawed by Congress in 1967. The line from the Tennessee Ernie Ford song 16 Tons, "I owe my soul to the company store," was not a metaphor for many of the people living through it. White Thang. The White Thang is a cryptid reported primarily in north-central Alabama, concentrated in a rough triangle between Morgan, Etowah, and Jefferson County. Sightings date back to the early 1900s and descriptions vary widely. Most witnesses describe something over 7 feet tall, covered in white or pale fur with glowing red eyes, but others describe it as more like a white lion, and some accounts give a body like a kangaroo with a cat's head. The inconsistency is unusual even by cryptid standards, and some accounts claim it can shapeshift entirely. Its most distinctive feature, besides the white fur, is a high-pitched scream that witnesses consistently compare to a woman wailing. It moves on 2 legs or 4 depending on the account, and is said to cover ground at troubling speed. A 2019 survey named it Alabama's most mythical creature, though it remains far less known nationally than similar creatures from other states. Theories range from an albino bear to an undiscovered primate to a supernatural guardian of the forest, and no physical evidence has ever surfaced. The woods of northern Alabama give it plenty of room to stay hidden if it wanted to, as Alabama ranks 4th in the nation for species diversity and holds over 23 million acres of forest land. Blue people of Troublesome Creek. In 1820, a French orphan named Martin Fugate settled on the banks of Troublesome Creek in eastern Kentucky and married a pale red-headed woman named Elizabeth Smith. What neither of them could have known was that they both carried the same rare recessive gene for a blood disorder called methemoglobinemia. Of their 7 children, 4 were born with blue skin. With no roads connecting Troublesome Creek to the outside world for nearly a century, the community stayed small and isolated, and the Fugates married other Fugates and neighboring families. One descendant, describing his own family tree, said simply, "If you'll notice, I'm kin to myself." The blue gene spread quietly through the hollow for generations. Then, in 1960, a hematologist named Madison Cawain started hearing rumors about blue people in the hills and drove back and forth until he found them. He described the first couple he located as bluer in hell and noted they were so embarrassed they wouldn't come into the waiting room. After ruling out heart and lung disease, he determined they lacked the enzyme diaphorase and treated them with methylene blue, which turned their skin pink within minutes. The last widely documented case was in 1975 when a baby named Benji Stacy was born dark blue and rushed to a university hospital, where doctors spent 2 days running tests before his grandmother finally said, "Have you ever heard of the blue Fugates of Troublesome Creek?" Hawk's Nest Tunnel Disaster. In 1930, at the height of the Great Depression, Union Carbide began drilling a 3-mile tunnel through Gowlie Mountain in West Virginia to divert water from the New River to a hydroelectric plant. Nearly 3,000 men worked inside the tunnel, at least 2/3 of them black migrants from the South who had been recruited with the promise of steady work. What they were drilling through was nearly pure silica, and the interior of the tunnel was described as a white cloud that impaired vision and clogged the lungs of workers. Men emerged from the tunnel covered in layers of white dust. Silicosis was well known to the medical profession and to engineers at the time. Safety measures included wet drilling, proper ventilation, and respirators were likewise widely understood. Eyewitnesses reported that wet drilling was only used when inspectors visited the site. The company paymaster was later reported to have said he knew they were going to kill them within 5 years, but didn't know they would kill them so quickly. Many of the dead were buried in unmarked graves on a nearby farm because local white cemeteries refused to accept black workers. In some cases, there was no attempt to notify the victim's family, and some families spent years believing their relative had simply run away. Union Carbide acknowledged 109 deaths. A congressional hearing placed the toll at 476. A physician who published the full story of the disaster estimated 764. Other estimates run as high as 2,000. Neither Union Carbide nor the construction firm was ever charged with anything. Jutacula Rock. Jutacula Rock is a large soapstone boulder sitting in a pasture in Jackson County, North Carolina, covered in over 1,500 carved petroglyphs. It contains more petroglyphs than any other known boulder east of the Mississippi River, and the carvings are thought to have been made intermittently between roughly 500 and 1700 AD. The rock is deeply tied to the Cherokee figure of Jutacula, described as a slant-eyed giant and master of all game animals. According to one version of the legend, the markings were left when Jutacula jumped from his farm on a mountaintop down to the valley below, the scratches from his landing etched permanently into the stone. Another tradition holds that the rock served as a stepping stone between the spirit world and the physical world. He is said to have had 7 fingers on each hand, and his handprint can reportedly still be identified on the lower right of the rock's surface. The oldest carvings actually predate Cherokee habitation of western North Carolina, meaning whoever carved the earliest marks was a different people entirely. The town of Cullowhee nearby is believed to derive its name from Jutacula-wee, meaning Jutacula's place. The eastern band of Cherokee still regard the site as spiritually significant and have been active in its preservation. Spearfinger. Spearfinger is a stone-skinned witch said to have roamed the ridges between eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. Her right index finger was long and sharp as an obsidian knife, which she was said to use to stab victims through the back of the neck or near the heart and extract their liver without leaving a visible mark. She was a shapeshifter who usually appeared as a harmless old woman, sometimes mimicking the voices of family members to call children out of the village. Parents used her legend to warn children against wandering into the forest alone. Some versions say she sewed her victims back up so cleanly that they only realized something was wrong as they slowly wasted away. Arrows shattered against her stone skin, and no conventional weapon could harm her. The Cherokee eventually trapped her in a concealed pit by lighting a fire to draw her in. During the attack, a chickadee landed on her right hand, and the warriors took it as a sign and drove their weapons into that spot where her heart was hidden. The chickadee has been known among the Cherokee as a truth teller ever since. Stopping the clocks. Stopping the clocks when someone dies is a tradition still observed in many Appalachian and Southern households, particularly among older generations and in more rural communities. The clock is stopped at the moment of death to mark the time, and mirrors in the house are turned to face the wall, believed to keep the soul from becoming trapped in the reflective glass. The reasoning varies by family. Some stop them simply to record the hour. Others hold that clocks are stopped so the dead soul knows its time has come, and mirrors are covered to prevent the departed from catching a backward glimpse that might tempt them to linger. A third explanation treats it as protective of the living, the idea being that stopping the clocks prevents another death from following. There's also an inverse version of the belief. If a clock that has long been motionless suddenly begins to tick or strike on its own, it is taken as a sign that death is on its way. The custom traces back to Scots-Irish settlers who carried similar practices from the British Isles, where the tradition held that time itself should pause out of respect for the dead. Sin Eater. The Sin Eater was a figure called upon after death to perform a specific ritual. The family would place bread and sometimes ale on the chest of the body, believed to absorb the sins of the deceased. The Sin Eater would then eat and drink, taking those sins into themselves and allowing the dead to enter heaven unburdened, while guaranteeing their own damnation in return. They were typically outcasts, avoided by the community, and feared as associates of witchcraft, sought out only when someone had died, and often leaving the house amid the curses of the mourners. The tradition carried into Appalachia with Welsh and Scots-Irish settlers, though how widespread it actually became there is debated, with some historians arguing the practice arrived more as a story than a functioning ritual. The last documented Sin Eater in England was a farmer named Richard Munslow, who died in 1906, believed to have taken on the role after losing 4 of his children, 3 of them within a single week. Tell the bees. Telling the bees is the tradition of informing a household's beehives when someone in the family has died. The belief held that the bees needed to be told of a death so they could mourn properly, and that failing to do so would cause the bees to leave the hive, stop producing honey, or bring further misfortune on the family. In some traditions, the hives were draped in black cloth. In others, the keeper knocked on each hive until they felt they had the bees' attention, and in some areas the news was sung rather than spoken. The practice is most strongly rooted in the British Isles and carried into Appalachia with the Scots-Irish and English settlers who brought it across with them. Deaths were not the only events worth reporting. Births, marriages, and moves were also traditionally announced to the hive, the idea being that bees were members of the household and needed to be kept informed of family affairs like anyone else. In the Frank C. Brown collection of North Carolina folklore, the tradition is documented alongside the belief that if bees are not told when their owner dies and the hives are not moved, the entire colony will perish. The custom drew renewed attention in 2022 when the royal beekeeper walked the grounds of Buckingham Palace to inform the royal hives of Queen Elizabeth's death, a moment that surprised many people who had never encountered the tradition before. Elkmont Ghost Town. Elkmont began as a logging camp in 1908 when the Little River Lumber Company used the land as a base for operations deep in the Tennessee Smokies. To move the timber out, the company built a railroad connecting the site to a sawmill in the valley, and before long, that same railroad was carrying a different kind of passenger. In 1910, the company sold 50 acres to a group of Knoxville businessmen who formed the Appalachian Club, built a hotel, and began selling cottages to members. By 1912, a second resort, the Wonderland Club, opened on a hill overlooking the settlement. The 1910s and 1920s were the height of it, with dances, live music, and a river dammed into a swimming hole. When the Great Smoky Mountains National Park was established in 1934, the cottage owners were allowed to stay under lifetime leases, which were later converted to 20-year terms. The leases were renewed once in 1972, then denied in 1992. People packed up and left, and over 70 buildings were abandoned with nobody to maintain them. The Park Service planned to demolish everything and let the forest reclaim the land, but the buildings were saved when they were added to the National Register of Historic Places. Today, the cottages sit in varying states of decay along the old main street, porches collapsing, interiors open to the weather, and the forest slowly pulling everything back. As of 2023, 16 of the preserved buildings are open to the public. Lost Smoky Mountains Gold Mine. Around the time of the Civil War, a blacksmith named Perry Schultz was working in the Greenbrier section of the Smokies when he reportedly struck a shallow streak of pure gold near Webb Creek in Upper Greenbrier Cove. In 1867, Schultz obtained a corporate charter from the state of Tennessee to mine in the area around Greenbrier Pinnacle and the surrounding mountains. The charter was only licensed for mining silver, lead, copper, and zinc, with no mention of gold. Whether that was deliberate misdirection or simply how charters were written at the time, nobody knows. What people did notice was that Schultz was always remembered as having plenty of silver dollars in his pocket, while most men in the area had no money at all. Legend has it that the mine included a long tunnel beginning at Porter's Flat in Tennessee and ending on the North Carolina side of the Smokies. The story largely faded until 1967, when a man named Walt Rice purchased Schultz's old home and found a clay pot buried in the garden. Inside it were gold and silver coins valued at $37,000, which sent treasure hunters back into the Greenbrier area looking for the mine. No gold mine has ever been found in the Greenbrier section of the park. The land is now inside Great Smoky Mountains National Park, which means any digging is federally prohibited regardless of what might be underneath it. The coins from the garden are the only physical evidence that Perry Schultz ever found anything at all. Ringing Rocks of Pennsylvania. In Bucks County, Pennsylvania, there is a 7-acre boulder field where the rocks ring like bells when struck with a hammer. The field sits at the top of a hill, which is unusual, as most boulder fields form at the base of slopes. There are no clear indicators that a glacier formed it, and the area notably lacks the plant and animal life you would expect in a woodland setting. About 2/3 of the rock in the field produce nothing but a dull thud when struck, while the remaining third ring with clear bell-like tones. The silent rocks are virtually indistinguishable from the ringing ones. In 1890, a local physician named Dr. J.J. Ott collected rocks with varying pitches, arranged them, and performed a concert for the Bucks County Historical Society, accompanied by a brass band. The tones of the rocks were reportedly audible above the instruments. The leading scientific theory, proposed by 2 Rutgers University geologists in 1970, suggests the rocks are under an unusual amount of internal tensile stress. Repeated rainfall causes the outer surface of the diabase rock to expand through chemical weathering, adding tension to the core and raising its resonance frequency. Rocks that don't ring may have simply cracked under too much accumulated stress. The theory is plausible, but has never been conclusively tested in a laboratory, and no comprehensive scientific study of the boulder field has been undertaken in over 50 years. Sensabaugh Tunnel. Sensabaugh Tunnel is a 1-lane concrete tunnel built in the early 1920s near Kingsport, Tennessee, on land that once belonged to the Sensabaugh family. A stream flows around and through it, and the walls are covered in graffiti. The legend most often told is that a man named Edward Sensabaugh went mad, murdered his family, and threw their bodies into the creek running through the tunnel. Visitors claim that if you cut your engine in the middle of the tunnel, it won't restart, and that you can hear a baby crying in the dark, and that Edward's footsteps approach the car before the engine suddenly turns back on. Historical records tell a different story. Edward Sensabaugh lived into old age, and none of his children died as babies. The most likely origin of the haunting is that as teenagers started using the tunnel for mischief in the 1950s, Edward would hide at one end and let out a shrill scream that echoed through the concrete, scaring them off. The acoustics of the tunnel did the rest. What started as an old man chasing teenagers away from his property became, over the following decades, one of the most visited haunted sites in East Tennessee. The Greenbrier Bunker. Beneath the Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, there is a fully equipped nuclear bunker that sat hidden for over 30 years. In 1955, Eisenhower instructed the Department of Defense to draft emergency relocation plans for Congress in case of a nuclear strike, and the Army Corps of Engineers selected the Greenbrier for its location, close enough to Washington but far enough to survive an atomic blast. Construction was completed in 1962, the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, under the cover story of a new hotel wing. Workers were suspicious of the sheer volume of concrete being poured, with one recalling that nobody said it outright, but a fool would have known. The facility was maintained by government workers posing as hotel employees under a dummy company whose official purpose was maintaining the hotel's televisions. One of the 4 blast doors weighed over 28 tons. Almost no members of Congress were ever aware it existed, only the leadership was briefed. And despite being kept operational and fully stocked for decades, it was never used. In 1992, a Washington Post reporter revealed its existence, and it was immediately decommissioned. Ghost of Joe Baldwin. In 1864, a conductor named Joe Baldwin was riding in the last car of a train near Macon, North Carolina, when it came uncoupled from the rest. He ran to the back of the car and frantically waved his lantern to warn an oncoming train following behind, but his efforts failed. He was decapitated in the collision. His head was never found. Shortly afterward, a flickering light began appearing along the tracks near the site of the wreck, moving back and forth as if someone were swinging a lantern. It became so common and convincing that the railroad ordered its engineers not to stop for the light, and signalmen at Macon eventually used 2 lights, one red and one green, specifically to distinguish real signals from Joe Baldwin's ghost. President Grover Cleveland's train stopped at Macon in 1889, and when he asked why the signalman used 2 lights instead of 1, he was told the full story. Cleveland later shared it with colleagues in Washington, spreading the legend nationally. The light was seen regularly for over a century. When the railroad removed the tracks in 1977, the sighting stopped. A search of newspaper records found no documentation of a Joe Baldwin, but did turn up an account of a conductor named Charles Baldwin killed on the same line near the same location in 1856. Smoke Wolves. The smoke wolves are a cryptid from the Tiger Valley in northern West Virginia, described as large black wolf-like creatures with glowing red eyes that seem to dissolve in and out of the dark rather than simply move through it. They reportedly travel in packs, and unlike most Appalachian cryptids, they aren't described as reclusive. One witness described them as pure evil, saying they kill for fun, and that the only thing known to deter them is the sound of rattling chains. Bounties were paid on wolves in West Virginia through the late 1800s, and the last recorded wolf in the state was killed in 1900. And there are no wolves there today. According to locals, large wolf-like creatures with red eyes began appearing in the valley after that removal, which raises the question of whether something was always there and simply went unnoticed while real wolves occupied the same territory. A group called Ames initially went to the valley to prove that actual wolves had survived in the region, but the more they spoke to locals, the more they found accounts that didn't fit a straightforward, natural explanation. Haunted Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary sits deep in the mountains of Morgan County, Tennessee, and operated from 1896 until 2009. Known as the end of the line, it was Tennessee's first maximum security prison, and inmates were forced to quarry the sandstone used to construct the very walls that held them. An estimated 10,000 men died during its operation, at least 100 executions were carried out, and the prison averaged roughly one murder per week. James Earl Ray, convicted of assassinating Martin Luther King Jr., escaped in 1977 by scaling the wall, but made it only about 8 miles before the terrain brought him down. Since its closure, the hauntings have been widely reported. The chapel is considered the most active area, with EVP recordings capturing words like hell, beast, and pain, and cold spots reported even in summer. One of the most frequently encountered entities is called the Creeper, believed to be the ghost of a prisoner stabbed in the throat and left to die in a padded cell, whose figure is seen crawling across the auditorium floor. The prison's own tour guide reportedly refuses to enter D Block, saying simply that's where the bad things happened. Legend of the Little People of Smokies. The Yunwi Yusti, or Little People, are among the most enduring figures in Cherokee tradition. They are said to live in rock caves on the sides of mountains, stand barely knee-high, and have hair so long it almost touches the ground. They're also said to spend much of their time drumming and dancing, and are ordinarily helpful and generous, known to lead lost children back to their parents. There are 3 clans within the Little People. The Laurel clan are the tricksters, known to lead hunters the wrong way, hide tools and clothing, tug on fishing lines, and send travelers on fruitless searches by moving the sound of their drums whenever someone follows it. The Rock clan are more severe, capable of casting illness or misfortune on those who disturb their homes or disrespect their traditions. One Cherokee elder, recounting what his grandfather had told him, described calling on the Little People to find lost children. He said that sometimes the children were found standing near a road where the Little People had led them out, and sometimes they were never found at all because the Little People had led them deeper into their own world, where the children became like them, playing and laughing forever. The same elder noted that he believed the Little People were becoming fewer, driven deeper into remote places by highways, plains, and the shrinking of the wilderness. When asked what would happen to them, he said they would simply become something else. Fog, maybe, or a pool of water, perhaps a raven. Ghost Riders in the Sky. Ghost Riders in the Sky is a 1948 song written by Stan Jones, but the story behind it is older. Jones said the idea came from a Native American legend told to him when he was about 12 years old by an old man living near Douglas, Arizona. The legend describes souls of the departed as ghost riders in the sky, damned cowboys condemned to chase the devil's herd of red-eyed cattle across the heavens for eternity, never catching them. One of the riders warns a living cowboy that if he doesn't change his ways, he'll be joining them. The story has been connected to the ancient European myth of the Wild Hunt, a tradition found across Northern Europe, Wales, Ireland, Scandinavia, Germany, and France, describing a spectral hunting party thundering through the sky as an omen of doom. Jacob Grimm documented it in 1835 as a survival of the Germanic pagan tradition, with the most common leader being Odin. The Wild Hunt traveled to Appalachia and the American South with Scots-Irish settlers, where it quietly merged with local legends before eventually being transplanted to the American West in the form of phantom cowboys. The Western Writers of America later voted Ghost Riders in the Sky the greatest Western song of all time. More than 50 artists have recorded it, including Johnny Cash, Vaughn Monroe, Burl Ives, and Marty Robbins, and it is widely thought to have influenced the Doors' Riders on the Storm. Lantern of Nolan Creek. The Nolan Creek Trail runs along the north shore of Fontana Lake in the North Carolina side of the Smokies, passing through land that was once home to several tight-knit mountain communities before the lake swallowed the valley. The trail passes through the remains of those settlements, with gravestones marking the path and old homestead foundations still visible in the underbrush. The legend centers on a young farm girl who gets lost in the surrounding forest. As she calls out for her father, she becomes more disoriented in the mist. The father searches frantically through the night carrying a lantern and is found dead shortly after, with no trace of his daughter anywhere. Some versions of the story say she was taken by Spearfinger, the Cherokee shapeshifter said to prowl the highest ridges of the Smokies and prey on children who wander too far from their families. Those who encounter the light on the trail describe it as a flickering glow moving through the trees, and the story goes that it leads lost hikers back to the trailhead. The father never found his daughter in life, and the legend holds that he is still out there looking, his lantern moving through the same dark woods where she disappeared. Whether the light is him or simply the kind of thing the mind produces when it is alone in the forest at night is a question the trail tends to leave unanswered. Old Green Eyes. Old Green Eyes is a legend tied to Chickamauga battlefield in northern Georgia, the site of one of the bloodiest two-day battles of the Civil War. The Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863 produced roughly 35,000 casualties, second only to Gettysburg. The name Chickamauga itself comes from Cherokee and is said to mean river of death. The most common version describes Old Green Eyes as a soldier decapitated by a cannonball, still searching the battlefield for his missing body. Other descriptions portray something older and inhuman, a creature with long fangs and glowing green eyes said to have haunted the land long before the Civil War. The park's own historian later admitted he invented the modern version of the story in the 1950s, adapted from a German legend he heard while stationed in the Black Forest after World War II. The historian was Edward Tinney, and the admission did little to slow the sightings, least of all his own. Around 4 in the morning, during a 1976 patrol near Glen Kelly Road, Tinney came across a figure over 6 feet tall in a long black cloak with waist-length stringy hair walking toward him. When it drew parallel, it turned and smiled. "The eyes, I'll never forget those eyes," he said in a 1981 interview. He quoted, "They were glaring, almost greenish-orange, flashing like some sort of wild animal. The teeth were long and pointed like fangs," end quote. A car came down the road, its headlights swept the figure, and it was gone. Tinney worked at Chickamauga until 1986 and died in 2010. His most repeated line about the battlefield was that whenever there has been great suffering, people are always seeing strange things. The Seneca Guns. Across Appalachia and the eastern seaboard, people have been reporting the same thing for centuries, a sudden deep boom with no visible source, loud enough to shake houses and rattle windows, with no storm in the sky and nothing on any seismograph. The name comes from James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote about the phenomenon at Seneca Lake in New York in 1850, describing the sound as resembling the explosion of a heavy piece of artillery that could be accounted for by none of the known laws of nature. Scientists have attempted to match the booms to seismic activity and kept coming up empty. Shallow earthquakes, atmospheric pressure changes, offshore wave activity, and sonic booms have all been proposed and none confirmed. The sonic boom theory runs into an obvious problem. The Seneca guns were being reported 50 years before anyone had learned to fly. At Seneca Lake itself, researchers recently found over 140 enormous craters at the bottom of the lake bed during a sonar survey and traced the booms there to methane gas trapped beneath the layers of sediment, building pressure until it bursts through and hits the surface with enough force to sound like cannon fire. Whether that explains every reported instance across the wider region is still an open question. The Haudenosaunee Iroquois had their own answer long before any of it was studied, telling early white settlers that the booms were the sound of the Great Spirit continuing his work of shaping the earth. Moundsville Penitentiary Shadow People. The West Virginia Penitentiary in Moundsville opened in 1876 and operated for 119 years, during which time it recorded 94 executions and 36 murders, and was dubbed Hell on Earth by a Cincinnati newspaper as early as 1886. The prison was built directly across the street from the Grave Creek Mound, one of the largest conical Native American burial mounds in the United States, built by the Adena culture around 250 to 150 BC. From nearly the beginning, inmates reported shadow figures moving through the cell blocks at night. Reports stretch back to the 1930s when night shift guards began spotting figures moving through the yard and restricted areas. Alarms would sound, guards would mobilize, and no one would ever be found. The most frequently reported entity is simply called the Shadow Man. One leading theory ties him to R.D. Wall, who was murdered in the prisoner's boiler room on October 8, 1979. Visitors to that area have reported a dark figure appearing in khaki clothing, and women in particular have reported feeling an unseen hand on their shoulders. Throughout the prison, visitors report seeing fleeting apparitions, hearing disembodied voices, and a recurring voice from empty rooms saying, "Help, I'm trapped." Yahoo of Southwest Virginia. The Yahoo of Southwest Virginia is a Bigfoot-like cryptid that has been part of Appalachian folklore for a long time, though pinning down its exact origins is surprisingly complicated. It's described as around 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, and makes a loud squall-like sound. It reportedly raids gardens, steals livestock, and is considered quite intelligent but extremely hostile. One of the more well-known connections to the creature comes from Daniel Boone, who reportedly told stories about killing a 10-foot hairy giant he called a Yahoo. Where the name itself comes from is a bit of a puzzle though. Gulliver's Travels, one of Boone's favorite books, features hairy man-like creatures called Yahoos, and Boone and his companions were known to use terms from that book fairly liberally. The Cherokee also had their own word for a hairy giant, Yahoo, which sounds close enough that the two likely got tangled together over time. Late in his life, Boone was at a dinner held in his honor when someone asked for a story, and he began telling of having shot one of these creatures in the Appalachian wilderness. He didn't get far before one of the men laughed and called it impossible, and Boone, deeply offended, refused to continue despite others asking him to. Glowing Forest of the Smokies. The Great Smoky Mountains have more than one reason to glow at night, and none of them have a clean explanation. The most well-known is foxfire, a phenomenon where certain bioluminescent fungi growing on rotting wood emit a faint, continuous green light in the dark. Species responsible include honey mushrooms, jack-o'-lanterns, dripping bonnets, and bitter oysters. A 2015 study theorized the glow exists to attract insects that spread their pores, though other theories suggest it works as a warning that the fungi are toxic. Neither has been conclusively proven. Early Appalachian settlers reportedly used foxfire to mark nighttime trails. Then there are the synchronous fireflies near Elkmont, which tune their flashes together and eventually align to produce coordinated pulses of light across entire stretches of forest. But the strangest may be the blue ghost firefly. Unlike most fireflies, blue ghosts don't flash at all. Instead, males glow continuously for up to a minute at a time with an eerie bluish-green color, drifting through the dark understory while faintless females glow from the ground below. On top of all of that, there are glowworms found only in the Appalachian region that produce the bluest bioluminescence of any known insect on Earth, stopping their glow entirely if even the smallest amount of ambient light disturbs them. The Legend of the Owlbat Witch. Along the banks of the Susquehanna River near Columbia, Pennsylvania, there is a small cryptid with an unusual reputation. The Owlbat Witch is described as a small, man-like creature standing around 4 feet tall, covered in dark hair, living in the wooded areas near Chickee's Rock, a heavily wooded cliff overlooking the river. Unlike most cryptids, it isn't particularly threatening. The creatures are named for a habit they supposedly possess, with the name being short for apple snitch, as they are reputed to steal apples from picnickers and occasionally throw the cores back at them. The name itself is contested. The most common explanation traces it to a Pennsylvania Dutch compound meaning apple snitch, but Tim Renner, co-host of the Strange Familiars podcast, believes the first part of the word may come from the German word Alb, meaning an elf or night spirit, linking the creature to older European beliefs brought into Pennsylvania by German-speaking settlers. The earliest clearly documented use of the word appears in Lancaster County papers in the early 1920s, though newspaper accounts of campers going out into the woods to hunt for the creature date back around 125 years. Theories about its origin range from escaped circus primates in the 1800s to a juvenile Bigfoot to something rooted in Susquehannock tradition. Sightings reportedly fell as industry pushed into the river corridor in the 19th century, after which the legend shifted from a genuine belief into more of a cautionary tale told to keep children out of the woods. It hasn't disappeared though, with reported encounters increasing since 2023. Mary Draper Ingalls. In midsummer of 1755, a band of about 16 Shawnee attacked the settlement of Draper's Meadow, located near today's Blacksburg, Virginia. They killed at least 4 people, including Colonel James Padden, who died sword in hand after killing 2 of the attackers. Among those taken captive was 23-year-old Mary Draper Ingalls and her 2 sons, Thomas, age 4, and George, age 2. Her husband William was out in the fields that day and was not captured. On the journey to the Shawnee town, Mary was allowed to roam the woods and had numerous opportunities to escape, but could not think of leaving her children. When they reached the town, she was separated from her sons, who were adopted into the tribe. She was then taken to the Big Bone Salt Lick to make salt for the tribe by boiling brine. It was there that she decided to run. She persuaded another captive woman, referred to only as the Old Dutch Woman, to escape with her. They asked permission to go gather wild grapes in the forest and simply kept walking. They carried a tomahawk, a knife, and 2 blankets. The Shawnee made only a brief search, assuming the 2 women had been destroyed by wild beasts. What followed was a trek of 500 to 600 miles back through the Appalachian wilderness, crossing numerous rivers and creeks. It was late November when Mary finally reached home, nearly 2 months after setting out. Her younger son George never returned and likely died in captivity. Thomas remained with the Shawnee for years and was ultimately ransomed in 1768, by which point he had to relearn how to speak English. Mary lived to 83 years old. Paint Creek Cabin Creek Mine War. In the spring of 1912, coal miners along Paint Creek and Cabin Creek in Kanawha County, West Virginia, walked off the job, and what followed was over a year of open warfare between workers and the coal industry. Tensions had been building for decades. Most miners lived in company towns with limited access to clean water, were paid in coal scrip redeemable only at company stores, and no matter how much they worked, lived in perpetual poverty. When operators denied a wage increase and refused to recognize the union, roughly 7,500 miners went on strike. The coal companies responded by bringing in over 300 agents from the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a private firm known across Appalachia for violently suppressing labor organizing. The mine district quickly became an armed camp as operators built machine gun emplacements, evicted strikers from their homes, and imported replacement workers. On the night of February 7, 1913, coal operators drove an armored, machine gun-equipped train through Holly Grove, a tent colony the Union had set up for evicted miners and their families, firing into the homes and tents. The governor declared martial law, and over 200 strikers were arrested without warrants and tried before military tribunals, even though civil courts were still in session. The guards and coal operators faced no consequences. The strike finally ended in July 1913, and it was only the beginning of what would become a decade of mine wars across southern West Virginia. Snallygaster. The snallygaster is a creature from the hills of western Maryland and the broader Appalachian region, described as half reptile, half bird, with a metallic beak lined with razor-sharp teeth, occasionally alongside octopus-like tentacles, rumored to swoop silently from the sky to carry off its victims and drain them of blood. The name traces back to the German phrase schneller Geist, meaning quick spirit, brought over by German immigrants who settled the region. The legend's most documented stretch came in early 1909, largely driven by a local Maryland newspaper looking to boost readership. Newspaper accounts throughout February and March 1909 described encounters with the beast having enormous wings, a long pointed bill, claws like steel hooks, and an eye in the center of its forehead, making screeches like a locomotive whistle. The Smithsonian Institution offered a reward for its hide, and President Theodore Roosevelt reportedly considered postponing an African safari to hunt it personally. It was later revealed the reports were a hoax. The legend didn't stay innocent for long. The creature was molded by the anxieties of settlers on the Appalachian frontier, blending European fears with local tensions over slavery and race, and newspaper stories from the era portrayed it as specifically preying on black people. During Prohibition, moonshiners in the mountains co-opted the old story to scare revenue agents away, using it to explain the sounds of explosions and bending metal coming from their stills at night. The Road to Nowhere. In early 1942, the Tennessee Valley Authority began construction of Fontana Dam on the Little Tennessee River to generate electricity for aluminum production and, indirectly, for the Manhattan Project at Oak Ridge. Over 1,300 families in the small communities of Fontana, Bushnell, Forney, Judson, Proctor, and Hazel Creek were forced to move. The flooding wiped out Highway 288, which had connected these communities to Bryson City and, more importantly, to their family cemeteries. The federal government promised to replace it with a new road stretching 30 miles along the north shore of the new Fontana Lake, providing the displaced families ongoing access to their ancestral graves. Construction began and then stopped. After federal concern over costs and environmental impact, construction halted in 1971 just shy of 6 miles after the completion of a single tunnel and bridge. A legal effort to force completion failed in 1983, and a 2007 environmental impact study concluded the terrain was too sensitive to finish the road. What remains is 6 miles of pavement ending abruptly at a quarter-mile tunnel that opens onto an overgrown gravel trail. A sign at the entrance reads, "Welcome to the Road to Nowhere, a broken promise, 1943 to question mark." For many families, the more pressing issue was never financial. 26 cemeteries remain miles from the lakeshore, accessible only via steep and poorly maintained trails. A $52 million settlement was paid to Swain County in 2010, with the last payment made in 2018. The road itself will remain unfinished. Great Dismal Swamp Maroon Communities. The Great Dismal Swamp sprawls more than 2,000 square miles across parts of Virginia and North Carolina. To most colonists, it was useless land, but to thousands of people escaping slavery, that uselessness was exactly the point. In 1728, surveyor William Byrd II encountered a family of Maroons during the first survey of the swamp and noted that he was well aware others were watching and hiding, writing that it is certain many slaves shelter themselves in this obscure part of the world. And research suggests that thousands lived there between 1700 and the 1860s, making it one of the largest Maroon colonies in the United States. Communities formed on small islands of relatively dry ground scattered throughout the swamp, where Maroons built elevated cabins lifted above the moist earth on wooden posts and most likely cultivated rice and grain fields. Tools were scarce, and the thick peat foundation provided few stone outcrops, so Maroons sometimes dug up and refashioned stone implements left behind thousands of years earlier by indigenous inhabitants. Deep swamp Maroons lived miles into the swamp on islands that were nearly impossible for outsiders to find. A militia force with dogs went in during 1823 in an attempt to remove the communities, but most people escaped. In 1847, North Carolina ultimately passed a law specifically aimed at apprehending the Maroons in the swamp. Neither effort succeeded, and the communities persisted until the Civil War ended slavery in 1865. Big Hoot. Big Hoot is a term coined by cryptozoologist Mark Hall to describe reported sightings of an enormous owl-like creature across the eastern United States, with a number of accounts coming from the Appalachian and Ohio River Valley regions. Described as around 4 feet tall with a wingspan of 10 to 12 feet, white in color and nocturnal, It was said to be capable of carrying off lambs, calves, dogs, and small children, with sightings reported from West Virginia, southern Ohio, the Ozarks, and elsewhere. Hall laid out the theory in his 2004 book, Thunderbirds: America's Living Legends of Giant Birds, noting the prevalence of giant bird and owl-like creature reports throughout the Ohio River Valley, and suggesting that Mothman itself might have been a more recent example of the same phenomenon. One of the more interesting aspects of the theory is that Hall believed the creature used camouflage to mimic the appearance of Bigfoot in wooded areas, which partly informed the name. Owls have been put forward as possible explanations for a range of cryptid and even extraterrestrial encounter reports, and the Big Hoot has been proposed as the creature behind some of West Virginia's various paranormal residents, possibly including the Mothman. One witness account from southern Ohio in 1982 described a large bird that looked exactly like a 10-foot tree standing still until it moved into a clearing and unfolded its wings. The closest known bird in appearance is the snowy owl, which is roughly half the reported size. Cades Cove. Cades Cove is an 11-mile valley loop in the Tennessee Smokies, one of the most visited spots in the most visited national park in the United States. Most people come for the wildlife and the preserved cabins, but the cove has a lair underneath all of that. Before European settlers arrived, the Cherokee camped and hunted here, and one of their leaders, Chief Cade, is said to be the namesake. By 1850, the population had grown to nearly 700 people, all living on farms in the valley. When the park was established, they were forced out, and some residents signed life leases allowing them to stay on their land until they died, with restrictions on hunting and logging. There are records of 14 cemeteries in Cades Cove, but only 11 have been located. At dusk, visitors have reported seeing orbs hovering over the gravestones and a woman's face appearing on the side of the primitive Baptist church, which was built in 1887 and still stands in the cove today. The most endearing story from the area is the Cussing Cover, documented in a 1999 book of East Tennessee legends. Mavis Estep, one of the cove's residents, was terrified of lightning her entire life and made her husband Basil swear on her deathbed never to place her handmade quilt on a metal bed. Basil remarried, eventually broke the promise, and one night a flash of light burst into the cabin, charred him completely, and disintegrated the metal bed. The quilt, the Cussing Cover, was found in perfect condition. There hadn't been a thunderstorm that night. The quilt was eventually sold to a collector somewhere in the Smokies, and the story goes that it's still out there. Eternal Flame Falls. Tucked behind a small waterfall in Chestnut Ridge Park in western New York, there is a flame that has reportedly been burning for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. A small grotto at the waterfall's base emits natural gas which can be lit to produce a small flame, visible nearly year-round, although it can be extinguished and occasionally needs to be relit by passing hikers. The geology behind it is where things get genuinely strange. Scientists long believed the flame burned because gas pockets formed from ancient bedrock breaking down carbon molecules in the shale. But researchers from Indiana University found that the shale beneath the falls isn't actually hot enough or old enough to be producing that gas. Something else must be responsible, and to this day, they still don't know exactly what. A 2013 study also found the gas seeping from the falls contains unusually high concentrations of ethane and propane compared to other known natural gas seeps, suggesting the presence of a previously unknown geological mechanism for producing natural gas within shale. The flame itself is only about 4 to 8 inches tall, and the waterfall above it is seasonal, drying up in summer. When water is flowing and the flame is lit at the same time, the waterfall diffuses the light like a lampshade, creating an otherworldly glow. Milton Lizard. In the summer of 1975, a junkyard manager named Clarence Cable was walking through the Bluegrass Body Shop near Milton, Kentucky, when something emerged from behind the wrecked vehicles. He described it as a 15-foot lizard with big eyes similar to a frog's, an off-white coloring beneath its mouth, and black and white stripes running across its body with quarter-sized speckles over it. It hissed at him several times. Cable's brother Garrett was next, watching on July 27 as a pile of old car hoods began to vibrate and shift before the creature's head and shoulders pushed up through the debris. He went to find his brother, and when they came back, it was gone. A search party was organized but found nothing, and the creature was never seen again after that summer. One of the brothers suspected it might have been a monitor lizard that hatched from eggs left inside one of the damaged cars in the yard, which is about as grounded an explanation as anyone has offered. Similar giant lizard sightings had been recorded in the same general area as far back as the late 1800s, and as recently as 2012 and 2013, the Northern Kentucky Bigfoot Research Group investigated reports of large bipedal lizards in Carroll and Trimble counties, claiming to have found 3 unidentified toe tracks measuring 14 inches. Wood Booger of Norton. The wood booger is Southwest Virginia's version of Bigfoot, tied specifically to the mountains around Norton and Wise County. The name goes back to at least 1892, when a local newspaper called the Old Post reported on the creature, naming it after the boogeyman because it was rumored to carry off children who wandered into the woods at night. The bulk of reported sightings over the years have clustered between Norton and High Knob, an area of roughly 5 miles, with the creature generally described as 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in black or brown fur and heavily built. Things stayed relatively local until 2009, when a video surfaced on YouTube titled Beast of Gum Hill, showing what appeared to be a large bipedal figure crossing a creek ahead of someone on an ATV. The footage drew enough attention that Animal Planet's Finding Bigfoot spent a week in the area in 2011 filming an episode. Following the show's visit, Norton designated Flag Rock Recreation Area an official wood booger sanctuary and erected a statue of the creature there. With a population of around 3,900 and an economy that had long relied on nearby coal counties, the city began leading into the legend as a tourism draw, eventually launching an annual fall festival at Flag Rock complete with guided night searches, cryptid speakers, and hiking events. Appalachian Wind Gap Phenomenon. Scattered across the Appalachian ridges are dry notches where no rivers run. They look like passes, and in some ways they are, but the valleys leading into them simply stop. These are wind gaps, and what they represent is a river that no longer exists. Wind gaps form through stream piracy, where a more dominant adjacent stream captures the headwaters of another, diverting its flow and leaving the original valley as a dry remnant. 2 rivers run parallel on either side of a ridge. One gradually erodes its way headward, eventually breaking through and intercepting the other. The stolen river gets rerouted, and the old gap is left stranded. The Shenandoah River is a clear example. It was the first tributary in western Virginia to reach the soft limestone layer beneath the valley, and from there it intercepted stream after stream west of the Blue Ridge, beheading the Occoquan, then the Rappahannock, and then tributaries of the York River. Each one left a wind gap behind. In the field, these gaps still preserve gravel terraces and meander scars as evidence of prior stream activity. Many are now followed by roads and hiking trails, with travelers passing through valleys that ancient rivers carved and then quietly abandoned. Lucy of Roaring Fork. The Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail outside Gatlinburg follows one of the park's fastest moving streams through a stretch of old-growth forest dotted with the remains of early settler cabins and old mills. The community that once lived here was small and tight-knit, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and the names passed down from that era read like something out of another century entirely. Among the families living along Roaring Fork in the early 1900s was a girl named Lucy, described as pretty, smart, and well-liked, the kind of young woman every neighboring family had their eye on for their son. Tragedy struck when her family's cabin caught fire on a cold winter night and Lucy was unable to escape. Not long after, a young man named Foster was riding his horse down the old forest trail one evening when he came across a barefoot woman in the dark. He offered her a ride, brought her home, and by the time they arrived, he had fallen completely in love with her. He returned the following day to ask her parents for permission to marry her and was told she had died quite some time before he had even met her. The story fits the shape of a vanishing hitchhiker legend, one of the oldest and most widespread folk story structures there is, and versions of it exist in almost every culture. What keeps the Lucy version alive is the specificity of the place. Sightings of a barefoot woman along the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail have continued to be reported by visitors to the park. The trail closes every winter, and some locals say that was never really about the road conditions. Haunted Octagon Mansion. The Octagon Mansion at 585 West Main Street in Whitville, Virginia, is one of the only two octagonal houses in Southwest Virginia. It was built in 1870 by Dr. Henry Quincy Adams Boyer and sold to Reverend Dexter Snow in 1874, who finished its construction. Wings were added in 1890, giving it a distinctive shape that adds to the general strangeness of the property, including a curious diagonal passageway running through the interior. The building sat empty for years before being purchased in 2019, after which the new owner began documenting what he described as doors closing on their own, objects flying across rooms, and the presence of uninvited figures. The most frequently reported presence is that of a little girl believed to have died during Whitville's 1950s polio outbreak, in which 184 residents contracted the disease and 17 died. As the epidemic worsened, ambulances ran short and hearses from local funeral homes had to drive patients to hospitals. The town's broader history adds considerably more weight to the building. Union soldiers who passed through or died during Toland's raid of 1863 and Stoneman's raid of 1865 are also said to linger there, connected to what witnesses at the time described as an avenue of death, as Confederate soldiers and civilians fired on the Union Brigade from inside their own homes. Fayetteville Stone Face. Along a narrow trail off Fayette Station Road near the Canyon Rim Visitor Center in Fayetteville, West Virginia, there is a life-sized face carved into a mossy sandstone cliff that most hikers walk right past without noticing. Its origins are sometimes regarded as a mystery, but the carving was likely made in the 1950s by a coal miner named Johnson who lived nearby. The foundations of his house are still visible among the ferns a little farther down the path, and he also carved his surname into a stone that hikers use to cross a small stream that cascades into the New River Gorge. One researcher who has written about the face believes Johnson carved it for the pure joy of expression during a period when coal mining was going into decline in the area, leaving him with spare time on his hands. The carving sits on National Park Service land and has quietly gathered a following as tourism in New River Gorge has grown. Gene Kistler, a rock climber who first came across it in the 1980s, describes it as a kind of benevolent spirit of the forest, and recalls burying a screech owl he had tried to nurse back to health beneath the small overhang nearby, feeling that the spot had the right kind of energy for it. Massacre of Saltville. On October 2nd, 1864, Union General Stephen Burbridge led a force of over 5,000 men into the steep valleys around Saltville, Virginia, with the straightforward objective: destroy the salt works that supplied a significant portion of the Confederacy's food preservation. Salt produced at Saltville accounted for up to 2/3 of the salt used by the Confederacy, making it one of the most strategically important sites in the South. Among Burbridge's troops were men of the newly formed 5th United States Colored Cavalry, most of them former slaves given at most 3 weeks of training before the raid. The attack failed. Burbridge withdrew during the early hours of October 3rd, leaving wounded men strewn across the battlefield. What happened the next morning is what gave the battle its lasting name. As Confederate forces scoured the field, some soldiers, possibly under orders from Cavalry Commander Felix Robertson, systematically murdered around 50 wounded black soldiers. A guerrilla fighter named Champ Ferguson led a company through the battlefield doing much of the killing, including at a nearby hospital where prisoners were being held. When Robert E. Lee learned of the massacre, he condemned the treatment of the prisoners and directed that the responsible officer be arrested. Robertson avoided Confederate authorities entirely. Ferguson was ultimately captured after the war, tried by a military court in Nashville, found guilty of murder, and hanged in October 1865. Old Man of the Mountain. The Old Man of the Mountain was a series of 5 granite cliff ledges on Cannon Mountain in Franconia Notch, New Hampshire, that, when viewed from the north, formed the unmistakable profile of a human face. It sat 1,200 feet above Profile Lake, stood 40 feet tall, and had been the state emblem since 1945, appearing on license plates, highway signs, and the state quarter. The formation was always slowly falling apart. It was created by degradation, not construction, which meant its fate was always to collapse. By the 1920s, freezing and thawing had opened fissures wide enough to be mended with chains. In 1957, the state legislature appropriated funds for more extensive work using cement, plastic covering, steel rods and turnbuckles, and a concrete gutter to divert runoff. A team maintained the patchwork every summer for decades. A storm was rolling through Franconia Notch in the early hours of May 3, 2003. The churning clouds scraped along the valley walls, obscuring the old man's perch on Cannon Mountain. Some kids camping nearby heard something that might have been the collapse, but it couldn't be confirmed because the old man departed without a single witness. The rubble was discovered the following morning. Statesman Daniel Webster had once said that up in the mountains of New Hampshire, God Almighty had hung out a sign to show that there he makes men. The state never replaced it. The profile still appears on the quarter. The Watauga Association. In 1772, a group of settlers along the Watauga River in present-day northeastern Tennessee found themselves in an unusual situation. A survey had revealed that their settlements were not in Virginia as they had believed, but on land that Britain had guaranteed to the Cherokee Nation. They were told to disband and relocate. They did neither. Being outside the claims of any colony, the settlers negotiated a 10-year land lease directly with the Cherokee and established the Watauga Association to provide basic government functions. Based on the Virginia legal system, a panel of 5 commissioners regulated all judicial activities, including court cases, legal documents, and land titles. The primary focus was the practical needs of routine government, and it made no claims to independence from Great Britain. They simply needed functioning law where none existed. Years before independence was declared in Philadelphia, a functioning constitution was already being written and enforced in the Appalachian backcountry. When the Revolution began, the settlers reorganized as the Washington District, likely the first political entity named after George Washington, and petitioned to be annexed by North Carolina. The same people who built the association went on to muster the Overmountain men at Sycamore Shoals, attempt the state of Franklin, and ultimately form the state of Tennessee. The Watauga Association was essentially the first chapter of it all. Linville Caverns. The Linville Gorge is one of the most inaccessible stretches of terrain in the eastern United States, with no road at the bottom and roughly 10,000 acres of virgin forest that was never logged because the terrain made it impractical. The caverns inside nearby Humpback Mountain carry the same quality of things left undiscovered. For centuries, the caverns were unknown to most people until a fishing expedition in the early 1800s noticed trout swimming in and out of what appeared to be solid rock. A small opening in the mountainside led them into a subterranean world of stalactites, underground streams, and chambers whose ceilings were beyond the reach of their torches. The man who later wrote about the discovery described emerging into an immense passage that looked like the arch of a grand cathedral, too perfect to be anything human. The cave served as a hiding place for Civil War deserters, who lived inside for months until smoke from their fires emerged from the top of Humpback Mountain and was spotted by Union soldiers. In the late 1800s, Thomas Edison sent a geologist named William Hidden into the caverns to search for platinum. He returned with nothing. Multiple rooms within the caverns remain unexplored to this day, and the source of the underground streams flowing water is still uncertain. A 250-foot weighted anchor dropped into a pool deep inside never hit the bottom. Of the total 1,300 feet of subterranean environment, only 600 feet is open to visitors. The deepest 700 feet is considered too dangerous for human traffic. Millboro regression case. In 1986, a California hypnotherapist named Dr. Marge Reeder was conducting a routine session with a patient named Maureen Williamson when, under hypnosis, Williamson began describing life in a small Virginia town during the Civil War, giving her name as Rebecca and placing herself in a community she called Marlboro in 1861. What followed became one of the stranger documented cases in past life research. Over the next several years, more than 35 people, most from around Lake Alinsor, California, were identified who could recall under hypnosis life in the same small Virginia town during the Civil War. None appeared to know each other before the sessions, and the town they described corresponded to Millboro, a real community in Bath County, Virginia. Different subjects described the same events and people from different vantage points, and Reeder used details from the sessions to locate what she claimed were secret tunnels and hideaways during expeditions to Millboro. Skeptics pointed out that group regression sessions were held, making it difficult to rule out subjects influencing each other's accounts. Whether the details unearthed reflected something genuinely unexplained or simply the suggestibility of the hypnotized mind remains an open question. Disappearances of Roan Mountain. In the summer of 1983, two separate people vanished on Roan Mountain within weeks of each other, and the circumstances of both cases left investigators and experienced searchers with more questions than answers. On July 2nd, 8-year-old Michael Reel walked away from his family's campsite at Roan Mountain State Park carrying an aluminum pot to fetch water. Within 5 minutes of being seen, he had vanished entirely. One veteran forest ranger with extensive search experience said openly that things seemed a little fishy, and Michael's mother maintained throughout the search that she believed her son had been taken. Search teams with dogs, a helicopter, and rescue units from across western North Carolina and upper East Tennessee combed the mountain for days. He was eventually found a week later, still clutching the pot, alive but weak from living on berries and wild apples. Searchers believed he had never wandered more than a mile or two from where he disappeared, but the dense rhododendron undergrowth had kept him invisible to everyone looking for him. Less than 3 weeks later, a 20-year-old man named Larry Davenport disappeared from the same mountain while his friends were preparing lunch. He walked into the woods and did not come back. He was found days later after walking up to a residence 8 miles down the mountain, wearing nothing but a curtain he had found in an abandoned house, covered in scratches and sometimes coherent, sometimes not. Roan Mountain's terrain, dense with rhododendron thickets and prone to sudden fog and weather shifts, has a long history of swallowing people whole. Neither case was ever fully explained. Appalachian witch trials. Virginia holds the distinction of having the first formal witchcraft accusation in any British North American colony in 1626, and also hosted the last witchcraft trial in the mainland colonies in 1730. Virginia courts were generally reluctant to hear witchcraft accusations and even more reluctant to convict, requiring the accuser to carry the burden of proof rather than the accused, which set them apart from the Salem courts significantly. Most cases were civil defamation suits between neighbors rather than criminal prosecutions. Virginia's most famous case was Grace Sherwood of Princess Anne County, a midwife whose neighbors accused her of bewitching their pigs, ruining their cotton crop, and riding one of them about at night before turning into a black cat and disappearing through a keyhole. She sued for defamation and lost, was thrown bound into the Lynn Haven River in 1706 and floated. She was imprisoned but ultimately freed, lived on her farm until she was 80, and was formally pardoned by the governor of Virginia in 2006, 300 years after her conviction. In 1891, newspapers across America picked up a story about women in Allegheny County, Virginia, accused of controlling their farming community through witchcraft. The article was reprinted for years and became one of the most widely circulated accounts of Appalachian witchcraft, contributing to decades of stereotype about the region and the woman it named. Clinch River Endemic Species Cluster. The Clinch River winds 300 miles through Appalachia and is home to 133 species of fish, with more mussel species than exist across all of Europe. Much of what makes the Clinch unusual comes down to how its mussels reproduce. Females carry fertilized eggs in their gills until they develop into a parasitic larval stage called glochidia, which must attach to a specific host fish to survive. Some species attract that fish by physically mimicking small prey animals to draw one close enough to release larvae onto its gills. Many mussel species depend on only one or a few specific fish, so if that fish disappears from a stretch of river, the mussels simply cannot reproduce there. Since 2016, 10 of the river's mussel species have gone extinct, with another 20 now considered endangered. The pheasant shell, once one of the most abundant species in the river, has dropped by more than 90%. The cause of the ongoing die-off has not been fully identified, and researchers are racing to propagate and reintroduce populations before more are permanently lost. Canaan Valley Cold Spots. Canaan Valley in Tucker County, West Virginia, sits at around 3,200 feet elevation and regularly records the coldest temperatures in the entire contiguous United States, often beating out locations far north and far higher in elevation. The reason is geology rather than mystery, though the effect is striking enough to feel like both. The valley is a frost hollow, a bowl-shaped concave area that experiences frost at a higher rate than surrounding terrain. Under certain conditions, cold air drains into and collects in the hollow, causing temperatures far more severe than on the peaks towering over it, which can be up to 1,000 feet higher in elevation. The temperature at the bottom of the 5-mile valley can differ by up to 40 degrees from areas just a few miles away. A scientific study described the valley as having summer temperatures similar to northern New England, an average seasonal snowfall higher than any large city in the United States, and a shorter growing season than Fairbanks, Alaska. On January 22, 2022, Canaan Valley recorded negative 31 degrees, and on the same day in 2024, it again recorded the lowest temperature in the contiguous states. January 22nd has become a habitually frigid date there in particular. Researchers who maintain the weather station have noted that if the wind had stayed calm through certain nights, the valley could have approached negative 40, which would set an all-time West Virginia record. Appalachian Black Panthers. Across Appalachia, from Tennessee and West Virginia up to the Carolinas, people have been reporting sightings of large black cats for well over a century. The local dialect even has a word for it. In parts of Appalachia, painter is just how you say panther, and it shows up in old sayings that have been passed around long enough that nobody really questions where they came from anymore. Sightings reportedly surged in the 1950s and kept climbing through the 1960s and 70s, around the same time deer populations were recovering, which people have pointed to as circumstantial evidence that something was out there taking advantage of the food supply. In 1977, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service hired a wildlife biologist named Robert Downing to spend several years actively searching for evidence of panthers in the southern Appalachians, and he ultimately concluded he had been unable to confirm any self-sustaining populations. The core problem is that melanistic cougars, meaning solid black mountain lions, are not considerably scientifically possible, which puts the whole category of sightings in an awkward place. If the Appalachian cat is a real animal, it would almost have to be a jaguar, but the region is well outside the jaguar's natural range and far colder in winter than anywhere jaguars are known to live. One explanation that gets raised is the exotic pet trade, since large cats have historically been easy to purchase and owners who can no longer keep them sometimes release them. Most wouldn't survive long, but some just might. Selu the Corn Mother. In Cherokee tradition, Selu was the first woman and goddess of corn. Her name literally means maize or corn in the Cherokee language. The story centers on her two sons discovering how she actually produced food. They crept to the storehouse and watched through the wall as Selu rubbed her stomach over a basket until it was half full of corn, then rubbed her arms until it was full to the top with beans. Convinced she was a witch, they decided to kill her. Selu already knew their thoughts before they spoke and told them that when they had killed her, they should clear a large piece of ground, drag her body 7 times around the circle and 7 times around the ground inside it, then stay up all night and watch. In the morning, she told them they would have plenty of corn. The boys obeyed, and in the spring Selu returned with the new corn. Because they did not follow her instructions exactly though, corn only grew in certain places rather than across the whole world. The green corn ceremony, traditionally held in late summer or early fall when the corn ripened, celebrates the first harvest of the year and is directly tied to Selu's story. A sacred fire is extinguished and a new one kindled, symbolizing renewal. The story is generally understood as being about the cost of sustenance and the cycle of sacrifice that makes continued life possible. Wallace Horse Cemetery. On the edge of Littleton, New Hampshire, tucked into a small clearing just off Mount Eustis Road, there is a fenced plot containing the graves of 3 horses. 2 of them, Maud and Molly, were described as being like children to Eli and Myra Wallace. The 3rd was given to Eli after his wife's death, and he cared for her until his own death. All 3 were buried with their harnesses, bridles, blankets, and feed boxes. The cemetery has been maintained for over 100 years. The graveyard made local news when a fragment of human skull was found buried among the horses. After some investigation, the origin turned out to be less than mysterious. Someone had buried it there after it had spent years in a private collection. Appalachian groundwater systems and lost rivers. Much of the Appalachian landscape sits on top of limestone and dolomite that has spent millions of years slowly dissolving. During the Appalachian mountain building events, rocks were folded, faulted, and fractured, and within the past 10 million years, caves, conduits, and underground drainage systems were dissolved into this rock by moving water. The result is a region where rivers do not always behave like rivers. The most characteristic feature of a karst landscape is the lack of surface streams, with most of the water flowing through underground channels and caves. West Virginia's Lost River is a direct example of this. The river is lost at Sandy Ridge between Baker and Wardensville, where during low water, the main flow sinks under large rocks into a subterranean passage and remains underground for a little more than 2 miles. The Lost River and the Kakapon River are actually the same river, separated only by a stretch underground, which led to the 2 getting different names entirely. The Swiss cheese nature of karst geology means that waterborne pollutants on the surface move quickly into groundwater with essentially no filtration. One researcher tested a well at a residence where the family was getting sick, placed tracer dye in the toilet, and found it in the well the next day. Groundwater can travel up to several miles a day through these underground networks. It is a landscape that looks solid from above but is riddled with passages below, and a significant portion of the region's drinking water moves through it. Beale ciphers. The Beale ciphers are a set of 3 coded messages that allegedly point to a buried treasure of gold, silver, and jewels somewhere in Bedford County, Virginia, estimated to be worth over $60 million today. The story originates from an 1885 pamphlet called the Beale Papers, which describes a man named Thomas J. Beale burying the treasure around 1820 and entrusting a locked iron box containing the encrypted messages to a local innkeeper named Robert Morris before disappearing and never being seen again. Only one of the 3 ciphers has ever been solved, using the Declaration of Independence as a key, and it describes the contents of the treasure in detail. The other 2, one supposedly giving the exact location and one listing the names of its rightful owners, have never been cracked despite over a century of attempts by professional cryptanalysts, computer scientists, and treasure hunters. William Friedman, the dominant figure in American code breaking during the first half of the 20th century, made the Beale ciphers part of his Signal Intelligence Service training program, describing them of being of diabolical ingenuity, specifically designed to lure the unwary reader. People from all walks of life have tried to find the treasure, some bankrupting themselves in the process, with one man spending over $70,000 using explosives and heavy machinery to dig up sections of land. The skeptical argument is fairly straightforward though. A 1982 analysis found linguistic anachronisms in the text, including words that didn't exist at the time the letters were supposedly written, and concluded the whole thing was almost certainly written by James B. Ward, the same man who published the pamphlet. Whether it's a genuine mystery or an elaborate 19th century hoax that just happened to work extremely well, the two remaining ciphers are still unsolved. Booger Hole. Booger Hole is a remote hollow in Clay County, West Virginia that made headlines from the late 1800s through 1917 for a string of unsolved murders in which most of the bodies were never found. A peddler named John Newman disappeared one evening while traveling between farmhouses. A stonemason vanished carrying $300 in his pocket. A watchmaker stopped for the night at the local schoolhouse and was never seen again, though a trail of blood led to a nearby creek. A woman named Lacey Ann Boggs was shot through the window of her house, reportedly because she had told someone she knew where one of the bodies was buried. Despite the best efforts of a town mob that posted notices and ultimately drove out the families of anyone suspected in the killings, none of the murders were ever solved. Although folklore holds that the community's name came from this violence, a contemporary press account shows the hollow was already called Booger Hole before the murders began. The name comes from the Appalachian use of booger as a word for boogeyman, which in retrospect turned out to be fitting enough. Oak Mound of Grave Creek. The Grave Creek Mound in Moundsville, West Virginia is one of the largest conical burial mounds in the United States, standing 62 feet high and 240 feet in diameter, built by the Adena people sometime between 250 and 150 BC. Moving more than 60,000 tons of dirt to build it, the Adena constructed it in successive stages over roughly 100 years. When it was excavated in 1838, the dig turned up burial chambers, beads, copper bracelets, and seashells, but what drew the most attention was a small inscribed sandstone disc about the size of a thumbnail. The Grave Creek stone, as it became known, sparked excitement among scholars who believed it might be evidence of a pre-Columbian writing system in North America, until a 2008 meeting of the West Virginia Archaeological Society where an anthropologist announced that the inscription traced back to a text written in 1782, making it an elaborate hoax. Who planted it remains unknown, though suspicion has fallen on a financier of the original excavation who stood to benefit from the find. The stone itself has since disappeared entirely, and nobody knows where it ended up, with theories placing it somewhere in England, Tennessee, or buried in a library in West Virginia. Fayette County Phantom Hitchhiker. The West Virginia Turnpike cuts through 88 miles of Appalachian mountain terrain, and the stretch that passes through Fayette County has been producing strange stories since construction on the road started in the early 1950s. Most of the reported activity clusters along a roughly 15-mile section between Mossy and the Beckley area, and a good number of the accounts come from state troopers. One of the most repeated stories involves a trooper who picked up a young man walking along the highway one night, only to turn and find the passenger seat completely empty moments later. A separate account describes something similar, a hitchhiker who had actually been arrested and placed in the back of a patrol car, and when the trooper turned around, the man was gone and the handcuffs were just lying on the seat. By 1971, enough stories had accumulated that the Associated Press reported that 22 motorists between Princeton and Bluefield claimed to have picked up a hitchhiker who vanished from their vehicles mid-drive, in some cases while traveling at 65 miles per hour, with the seatbelt still buckled on the front seat. Folklorist Dennis Dates suggested the turnpike's haunted reputation traces back to the land itself, noting that construction cut directly through the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek regions, sites of deadly mine wars and catastrophic floods where roughly 150 people died in disasters alone. Chestnut Blight and the Silence. The American chestnut once made up an estimated 25% of the hardwood canopy across the Appalachian forest, and for the people living there, it was woven into just about everything. In Appalachia, generations of people were rocked in chestnut cradles and buried in chestnut caskets. The nuts fed both people and wildlife through the winter. The timber was used for buildings and fences, and the bark was used in the tanning industry. Around 1904, a fungus called Cryphonectria parasitica, was accidentally introduced to North America, likely through imported nursery stock from Asia, and was first identified at the Bronx Zoo in New York. Asian chestnut species had co-evolved with the fungus and developed resistance, but the American chestnut had no such defenses. The fungus enters the tree through wounds in the bark, creating cankers that cut off the flow of nutrients and water. Within decades, it spread the length of the Appalachians and killed an estimated 4 billion trees. What followed wasn't a quick disappearance. Unlike most species that deteriorate within weeks or months of dying, the dead chestnut stood for decades as ghost-like forests among the mixed deciduous trees. The loss also rippled through the surrounding ecosystem, contributing to the extinction of 7 native moth species, a drastic drop in squirrel populations, and a slowdown in the recovery of deer, cougar, and bobcat populations. The chestnut still technically survives as root systems that send up new sprouts, but the blight causes a functional extinction as the trees die before reaching maturity to this day. Duayo. The Duayo is a cryptid out of Frederick County, Maryland, described as a 6-foot-tall wolf-like creature that walks upright, covered in dark fur with a long, bushy tail. According to local legend, it is the mortal enemy of the snallygaster, a flying reptilian creature also reported in the Maryland Blue Ridge Mountains, with their encounters supposedly dating back to the early settlement of the Middletown Valley. The story picked up serious traction in November 1965 when a man using the alias John Becker filed a report with the local state police claiming something as big as a bear, with long black hair and a bushy tail, had stood up on its hind legs and attacked him near Gambro State Park before running off into the woods. State police looked into it and could not find anyone named John Becker in Frederick County, no road called Fern Rock Road, and no evidence to support the story. A reporter at the Frederick News Post ran with it anyway, and the letters started pouring in. One woman from Adamstown called the paper demanding the coverage be stopped, saying her daughter was being treated for a nervous condition because of all the Duayo talk. By mid-December, the sightings had slowed, and the story faded almost as quickly as it had started, though scattered reports from the area around Gambro State Park continued turning up in the years that followed. Raven Rock. Raven Rock is a ridge looming over Jenkins, Kentucky, and on autumn nights, people have reported seeing a single light appear on its high flank, swinging and drifting as if someone is walking with a lantern. The legend behind it is that of a Confederate sentry who fell asleep at his post during the Civil War, was shot for dereliction of duty, and now paces the mountain with his lamp, trying forever to finish the watch he failed in life. The story fits the landscape well enough. Jenkins sits almost in the shadow of Pound Gap, a pass through Pine Mountain that saw real Civil War skirmishing in 1862, with Confederate pickets watching the ridgeline and Union scouts studying the same passes. Whether anyone was actually shot for sleeping on sentry duty at Raven Rock is another matter. Surviving wartime reports and county histories don't identify a specific soldier or execution that matches the legend. The light, though, keeps getting reported regardless. Appalachian dulcimer origins mystery. The Appalachian dulcimer is one of the only string instruments considered native to the United States, though where it actually came from is still not settled. Most Appalachian history was passed down orally, and the instrument left little documented record behind. The most widely accepted theory traces it back to a German instrument called the Scheitholt, believed to have been introduced by German immigrants into the Pennsylvania mountains and gradually modified as it spread south. The settlers changed the design partly because the Scheitholt kept getting damaged when players tried to speed it up to keep pace with fiddle tunes it was never built for. Other researchers pushed back on this entirely, pointing instead to Norwegian and Swedish instruments as the more likely source, noting that immigration history does show contact between Appalachian Highlanders and Northern Europeans at roughly the time dulcimers appeared. Gene Ritchie of Kentucky probably did more to bring the dulcimer outside the Appalachians than anyone else, eventually introducing it to figures like Richard Farina, who was brother-in-law to Juan Baez, and a friend of Bob Dylan, who went on to influence an entirely new generation of players. Over Mountain Men and the Battle of Kings Mountain. By the fall of 1780, the Revolutionary War in the South was going poorly for the Patriots. British Major Patrick Ferguson had been sent into the Carolina backcountry to recruit loyalists and sent a message to the over mountain settlements warning that if they didn't lay down their arms, he would march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay the country to waste with fire and sword. It had the opposite effect. Isaac Shelby rode 40 miles to consult with John Sevier, and the two agreed to raise armies and cross the mountains. Frontiersmen gathered at Sycamore Shoals, where black powder was manufactured by Mary Patton at a nearby hill, lead was mined at Bumpus Cove, and the local merchant volunteered funds. Militia officers selected the 900 best marksmen, put them on the 900 sturdiest horses, and rode 35 miles through a cold, rainy night. Ferguson had positioned his men atop King's Mountain and declared that all the forces of hell couldn't knock him off it. After an hour of fighting, he was shot multiple times trying to break through the Patriot line. Cornwallis abandoned his invasion of North Carolina entirely, and Thomas Jefferson later called the battle the turn of the tide of success. Atagahi. Somewhere deep in the wildest part of the Great Smoky Mountains, west of the headwaters of the Okanalefty River, the Cherokee have long believed there is a lake that most people will never see. Although all the Cherokee know it is there, no one has ever seen it, for the way is so difficult that only the animals know how to reach it. A stray hunter who came near the place would know of it only by the whirring sound of thousands of wild ducks flying overhead. On reaching the spot, he would find only a dry flat without bird or animal or blade of grass, unless he had first sharpened his spiritual vision through prayer, fasting, and an all-night vigil. To one who had kept watch through the night, it would appear at daybreak as a wide, shallow sheet of purple water, fed by springs spouting from the high cliffs around. One story tells of a young Cherokee man who was granted access to the lake after days of prayer and fasting, having proven he has no intention to hunt there. He marks the location with a pile of rocks. That winter, his people are brought to the brink of starvation, and he returns to shoot a bear with his bow. The bear falls into the purple water and emerges completely unharmed, telling him he has violated his oath. When the snowstorms passed, the Cherokee found the young man's body. It was clear he had died from a bear attack, but there were no tracks anywhere around him. The Cherokee still believe the lake is there today. From the top of Clingman's Dome, just at sunrise, you can sometimes observe morning mist rising from somewhere deep in the forest below, and some say that is the Atagahi. The Roan Mountain Phantom Lights. Roan Mountain sits on the border between North Carolina and Tennessee, a 5-mile-long ridge that climbs close to 6,400 feet at its peak. Reports of unexplained glowing orbs in the area have accumulated for well over a century, with sightings occurring mainly at night. The lights tend to appear as floating orbs drifting above the tree line, and accounts describe them in shades of white, blue-white, and occasionally orange, sometimes moving steadily and other times hovering in place. The Cherokee connection to the mountain runs deep. Local tradition holds that the lights are the spirits of Cherokee maidens searching for warriors lost in a battle that took place on the mountain. When the Cloudland Hotel was built on the summit in the 1880s, the lights and the sounds that accompanied them became harder to ignore. At night, guests described hearing a distant choir, along with shrieks, wails, and a low hum that rose and fell with the breeze. A scientist named Henry Colton came out to investigate and ultimately concluded the sounds were caused by friction and electricity generated at the mountain's narrowest ridges, though that explanation did little to quiet the stories. Travelers on mountain roads have reported eerie blue-white lights pacing alongside their cars, matching their speed precisely, slowing when they slow and keeping pace when they accelerate, only to disappear when stopped and reappear in the rearview mirror. Scientific investigations have largely failed to provide any definitive explanation. Lakes of the Clouds Hut. An AMC crew member was sent up to the Lakes of the Cloud Hut alone one spring to assess any winter damage before the season opened. Every year, the windows get boarded up tight from the outside against the brutal north winds, and that was exactly how we found them. He was supposed to radio back to the base once he arrived, but the afternoon passed with no response. By 8 that evening, there was still nothing, and the crew at the bottom started to get uneasy. They headed up early the next morning and found his backpack and gear laid out on the dining room floor, his radio sitting on a table still powered on. They called out for him and got no answer. Eventually, someone heard a sound coming from under the kitchen sink. They opened the cabinet and found him crouched inside, clutching an axe, soaked in sweat and shaking uncontrollably, repeating the same words, "Just get me the hell out of here." He was taken down the mountain and spent weeks recovering before he finally told anyone what had happened. After the long hike up, he sat down in the dining room to rest and go through his supplies. At some point, he felt a presence behind him, like someone was about to put their hands on his shoulders. He spun around and faced the back of the dining hall. There, pressed against one of the dining rooms, was a distorted face staring in at him. Then he looked at the next window and saw the same face, then the next. The same face in every single window, glaring back at him from behind the boards that were nailed shut from the outside. Nantahala. The Cherokee called the Nantahala the land of the noonday sun because the gorge walls towered so tall that direct sunlight could only reach the valley floor during the middle of the day, and even then only briefly. It is one of the wettest regions in the eastern United States, with rivers cutting gorges up to 2,000 feet deep through southwestern North Carolina. The Cherokee considered the Nantahala Gorge a spiritual place. There are legends told of Uktena, a giant horned serpent, and the mischievous little people said to inhabit the gorge. Within the forest also sits Juticula Rock, a massive soapstone boulder covered in over 1,500 individual carvings estimated to be anywhere from 500 to 5,000 years old. The Cherokee regarded it as a gateway between the spirit world and the physical world, and it was the domain of Juticula, a giant who traveled between this world and the underworld and served as the master of all game animals. There's also lingering folklore about ghost sounds heard around the rock at night, made stranger by the presence of a cemetery just a few hundred feet away. The forest itself was formally established in 1920 on land that had been the original Cherokee homeland, much of it seized through a series of treaties between 1721 and 1777, and ultimately through the Trail of Tears removal beginning in 1830. Beneath Nantahala Lake, created when the dam was built in 1942, lies the old Cherokee town of Aquon, now permanently submerged under several hundred feet of water. Appalachian Witch Bottles. Witch bottles are one of the older forms of protective folk magic in Appalachia, brought over largely by Scots-Irish, English, and German settlers and blended with Cherokee and African traditions already present in the mountains. The vessel could be anything from an old glass medicine bottle to a ceramic jug, hidden or buried at the most vulnerable points of the home, including the hearth, the chimney, the front door, inside the walls, or under the floorboards. The contents were what mattered. A typical bottle held urine, nail clippings, or hair from the people living in the home, along with pins, needles, and nails to wound any spirits that came looking, and red string to trap curses by forcing them to trail along the thread before reaching their target. The bottle acted as a decoy, pulling whatever had been sent toward the house into itself instead. Archaeologists have found physical examples. In 1976, a witch bottle dating to the 17th century was unearthed in Pennsylvania, buried upside down next to a house. In Tennessee, 4 medicine bottles were found underneath the floors of slave quarters at the Hermitage Plantation. Finding them during renovations of old homes is still not unusual, and the practice continued in some communities well into the early 20th century. Pre-Columbian Appalachian Copper Network. The people of the Scioto River Valley traveled over 300 miles by foot and boat to mine copper from either Lake Superior or the southern Appalachian Mountains. A southern Appalachian ore band extending from Ducktown, Tennessee to adjacent Georgia and northwest North Carolina was one of the main copper production areas in eastern North America. The Hopewell culture, which flourished roughly from 1 AD to 400 AD across the Ohio River Valley, built trade networks that pulled materials from enormous distances. Artifacts from Tennessee mound sites include copper masks, copper panpipes, and copper ear spools alongside mica sheets and marine shell beads, with materials traced to the Great Lakes region, North Carolina, and the Gulf Coast, connecting the sites to the ancient Hopewell trade network. Copper was viewed as a living thing with a spirit and was given ceremonial burials in the mounds. Historic and modern American Indian tribes continued to view copper as a sacred metal. In Ojibwa oral tradition, the great lynx or water panther was the protector of copper, a powerful creature whose horns and tail were made of the metal. Research has confirmed that copper was the most important metal used by Hopewell societies, described as exotic because it came from the outside, shining like the sun, but only if properly cared for. The scale of movement involved, hundreds of miles on foot and by canoe across interconnected river systems, represents one of the most extensive trade operations in pre-Columbian North America. The Curse of Mount Chocorua. Mount Chocorua rises at the eastern end of the White Mountains in New Hampshire, and the legend attached to it has circulated in tourist brochures and local histories for nearly 2 centuries. The most common version comes from an 1829 account by Boston writer Lydia Maria Child, who wrote it as an accompaniment to a Thomas Cole painting of the same scene. In her version, Chocorua's son died around 1720 after accidentally ingesting fox poison during a stay with a settler family named Campbell. When Campbell returned home to find his wife and children murdered, he blamed the grieving chief, pursued him to the summit of the mountain, and shot him. Chocorua's final words placed a curse on the settlers: lightning to blast their crops, wind and fire to destroy their homes, and death breathe upon their cattle. The curse appeared to work. Settlers in the area struggled for decades with poor harvests and dying livestock, though later scientific research attributed this to the area's mineral-contaminated soil rather than anything else. Bat Creek Stone. In 1889, a Smithsonian field agent named John Emmer excavated a burial mound along the Little Tennessee River near Bat Creek in Tennessee. The stone was reportedly found wrapped in copper wire beneath the skull in an undisturbed grave, accompanied by brass bracelets and iron nails. The project director declared the inscription was beyond question letters of the Cherokee alphabet, and it was published in the Smithsonian Annual Report and largely forgotten. It stayed that way for about 80 years until researchers noticed that the inscription, when flipped upside down from how it had been published, appeared to read as Paleo-Hebrew. This caused a storm of controversy because the Hebrew interpretation would support an argument for migration of Mediterranean peoples into Tennessee during the Roman period. The mainstream consensus today is that it is a 19th century fraud. A professor at Johns Hopkins concluded it belongs to the melodrama of American archaeology in the late 19th century, and that the resemblance to Hebrew was probably not coincidental but planted. A minority of researchers still contest this, pointing to a 2010 geological analysis that found no physical evidence of forgery and concluded the stone was consistent with centuries of burial in the mound. Nunnehi. The Nunnehi in Cherokee tradition are a race of immortal spirit people whose name translates roughly as the people who live anywhere or the people who live forever. They lived in the highlands of the old Cherokee country with townhouses inside Pilot Knob and under the old Niquosi Mound in North Carolina and another under Blood Mountain in Georgia. They were invisible except when they chose to be seen, and when they appeared they looked and spoke just like other Cherokee. They were fond of music and dancing, and hunters in the mountains would often hear drumming and singing coming from an invisible townhouse, but when they moved toward the sound it would shift and appear behind them or in another direction entirely so that they could never find it. The Nunnehi were considered protective rather than threatening. One of the most well-known stories describes an ancient attack on Niquosi by a powerful unknown tribe. As the Cherokee warriors were being overpowered, a stranger appeared and told the chief to retreat. The Niquosi Mound then opened and hundreds of Nunnehi warriors poured out onto the battlefield, becoming invisible as they approached the enemy and slaughtering all but those who surrendered and begged for mercy. In 1838, it is said the Nunnehi invited members of the Cherokee Nation to retreat to their domain at Pilot Knob and escape the forced removal to Oklahoma. Other Nunnehi are said to have migrated to Oklahoma ahead of those forced to walk the Trail of Tears. Uktena. Uktena is one of the most significant beings in Cherokee cosmology, described as a horned serpent as large around as a tree trunk covered in glittering scales with elk-like antlers and a blazing crystal set into its forehead called the Ulunsuti. According to the origin story recorded by ethnographer James Mooney, the Uktena began as a man transformed into a monster snake and sent to kill the sun during a time of plague. He failed at the task, grew bitter, and was banished to remote places. Whoever was seen by the Uktena was so dazed by the bright light of the crystal that they ran toward the snake rather than away. Even to see it sleeping was death, not to the hunter but to his family. The Ulunsuti was enormously sought after. During a war with the Shawnee, the Cherokee captured a medicine man named Aganyu Nisi, who, facing torture, bargained for his life by promising to retrieve it. Of all the warriors who had ever gone searching, only Aganyu Nisi came back. The stone he returned with was transparent and nearly bullet-shaped, with a blood-red streak running through the center. The owner kept it wrapped in deerskin inside an earthen jar in a secret cave, feeding it every 7 days with the blood of small game. The Ulunsuti remained with the Cherokee until at least the 1880s, when Mooney saw it himself. After that, it drops out of history and back into legend. Adena Mound Builders' collapse. The Adena were a mound-building culture centered on the Ohio River Valley and extending into West Virginia, Kentucky, and surrounding regions, flourishing from roughly 1000 BC to around 100 AD. They traded copper from the Great Lakes, marine shell from the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, and mica from the southern Appalachian Mountains, with evidence of their burial styles appearing in mounds as far away as Canada and New York. Their mounds were primarily burial structures, with the most important individuals placed at the center and grave goods reflecting the reach of their trade network. They also carved small stone tablets with stylized animal designs in deep relief, likely used to stamp patterns onto cloth or animal hides, or possibly for tattooing. What happened to them is genuinely unknown. Somewhere around 100 AD, the Adena may have dispersed, been driven away, or merged with the Hopewell, another mound-building group that occupied much of the same territory afterward and built on Adena burial traditions. The reasons for the decline of their trade networks are unknown, and analysis of the stylistic decoration of Adena artifacts has not revealed any apparent connection to any modern indigenous groups. Population movements in and out of the Ohio River Valley over the following 2,000 years have obscured any possible ethnic or genetic connections to later peoples. No one who built those mounds left a name for themselves that survived. Appalachian magnetic anomalies. The Brunswick magnetic anomaly lines up with what geologists call a suture zone, a structure formed during an ancient collision between two tectonic plates, buried roughly 9 to 12 miles below the surface. It marks the scar of the collision that built the southern Appalachian Mountains. Magnetic field variations recorded across the Blue Ridge and Piedmont provinces of Georgia suggest the presence of a strong conductor in the lower crust or upper mantle beneath the Blue Ridge, extending further to the northwest. Across the Appalachians more broadly, plutonic rocks form magnetic highs or lows depending on their composition. Major northeast trending fault systems leave strong linear magnetic signatures, and two sets of east trending lineaments throughout the range represent some of the most recent structural features visible in the aeromagnetic record. The anomalies are the geophysical record of continental collisions, buried rock bodies, and fault systems going back hundreds of millions of years, some of which are still not fully explained. The Appalachians are among the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, and what lies beneath them preserves a complicated and partly unread history. Swift Creek Culture Pottery Spread. The Swift Creek culture was a Middle Woodland period culture dating to around 100 to 800 CE, occupying parts of Georgia, Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, and Tennessee. What makes them particularly interesting to archaeologists is their pottery. Designs were carved into wooden paddles and stamped onto wet clay before firing, producing elaborate curvilinear patterns. No two designs were exactly the same. Because each paddle produced a unique imprint, researchers can match sherds from completely different sites back to the same carved paddle, meaning they can track the physical movement of specific vessels or paddles across hundreds of miles. Non-local vessels, particularly complicated stamped ones, were deposited almost exclusively in mortuary contexts, suggesting this pottery wasn't simply traded as a commodity but carried some kind of ceremonial weight. How exactly it moved, whether the pots themselves traveled, the paddles were passed between groups, or potters relocated, is still being worked out. Neutron activation analysis of 825 sherds and 130 clay samples has been used to determine vessel provenance and map the directions and intensity of social interaction across the region. The pottery essentially functions as a record of a communication network that would otherwise leave almost no trace. Underwater Panther of Cherokee lore. The Cherokee speak of the true lynx in their oral tradition, a giant bobcat with a long tail and a human face, which bears similarity to the Algonquin underwater panther but serves a different role in Cherokee mythology. James Mooney documented a story titled The Underground Panthers in his 1900 collection, placing a version of the tradition within Cherokee oral history. The broader underwater panther tradition describes a creature with the head and paws of a giant cat covered in scales, with dagger-like spikes running along its back and tail, living in the deepest parts of lakes and rivers where it causes storms, shifts currents, and drowns people. Some archaeologists believe that these feline serpent hybrid beings were major components of the southeastern ceremonial complex, the widespread religious system flourishing among Mississippian peoples from around 900 to 1500 AD, with depictions appearing on shell gorgets, copper plates, and pottery from major sites including Cahokia, Spiro, Etowah, and Moundville. Given the extensive pre-Columbian copper trade that ran through the southern Appalachians, the tradition of a powerful being guarding those deposits carries particular weight in the regional record. Lost language of the Yuchi. The Yuchi people, also known as the Soyaha, traditionally inhabited eastern Tennessee, though their origins remain a mystery and their language is a linguistic isolate that does not resemble any other Native American tongue. The Yuchi attracted considerable attention owing to the fact that they were one of the very few small groups in the eastern part of North America having an independent stock language. Their isolation in this respect, combined with the absence of a migration legend among them and their own claims, led to a belief that they were the most ancient inhabitants of the extreme southeastern United States. In 1997, only 12 to 19 elders still spoke the language out of an estimated Yuchi population of around 1,500. By 2009, only 5 fluent speakers remained, and by 2011, only 1. The language's isolation from neighboring tongues is particularly striking given that the Yuchi spent centuries in intimate contact with surrounding peoples. Most language isolates form because their speakers were physically isolated, but the Yuchi maintained their linguistic distinctiveness despite prolonged exchange with neighboring groups, apparently through a deliberate protectiveness of the language unusual even by the standards of other indigenous nations. The Spanish de Soto expedition encountered the Yuchi in southwest Virginia in 1541, and the Pardo expedition again in 1567. They left an archaeological record in the Middle Appalachian region that in Virginia remains largely undocumented by professional archaeologists to this day. Mississippian chiefdom collapse. The Mississippian culture built some of the most complex societies in pre-Columbian North America, organizing populations of thousands around large mound centers across the southeast and into the Appalachian region. Mississippian societies arose around 1000 CE and lasted until about 1600, with the largest site at Cahokia in present-day Illinois covering enormous territory and drawing tribute from towns and villages miles away. The collapse was not a single event. Climatic and ecological instability between around 1300 and 1400 have been cited as a possible cause for soil depletion, and the exodus from some major sites began before Europeans ever reached the North American coast, meaning other factors were involved before disease entered the picture. Severe warm season droughts occurred across the mid-continent between roughly 1350 and 1450 as part of Little Ice Age conditions, and Mississippian societies were heavily dependent on maize agriculture, making them especially vulnerable. Mississippian chiefdoms still existed when De Soto traveled to the southeast in the 1540s, but just a century later the mound sites were abandoned. Epidemics caused so many fatalities that they undermined the social order of many chiefdoms, and political structures collapsed in many places. The result was whole social groups relocating and the collapse of native chiefdoms as their populations were reduced and their authority structures were destroyed. Survivor groups eventually coalesced into the nations encountered by later colonists, including the Cherokee, Catawba, and Creek, many of whom were culturally distinct from the Mississippian societies that preceded them. No Man's Land of the Cumberland Gap. The Cumberland Gap sits where Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee converge in a narrow notch through the Cumberland Mountains, and for several decades in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the area around it existed in a genuinely contested, legal no man's land. A surveying error in 1779 placed the Kentucky-Tennessee border roughly 17 miles north of where it should have been, creating a strip of land 6 to 12 miles wide claimed simultaneously by both states. People living in the disputed territory had no clear sense of which state they actually resided in, and the dispute was not resolved until 1826. The gap itself was the main artery through the Appalachians during this period, and the volume of traffic moving through it attracts some of the most dangerous figures of the frontier era. The Harps, considered America's first documented serial killers, began their reign of terror in East Tennessee and then moved north through the Cumberland Gap and along the Wilderness Road into Kentucky, killing 2 men traveling from Maryland shortly after crossing. They were eventually driven by their bloodlust and considered too violent even for the outlaw den at Cave in Rock on the Ohio River. During the summer and fall of 1784 alone, more than 100 travelers were killed on the Kentucky side of the Gap. With 3 competing state jurisdictions, no reliable law enforcement, and hundreds of thousands of migrants funneling through a single narrow pass, the area around the Cumberland Gap represented one of the most genuinely lawless pockets of early American history. The lost state of Franklin. In 1784, North Carolina voted to hand its western lands over to Congress to help pay off Revolutionary War debts. The settlers living there, many of them the same over-mountain men who had fought at Kings Mountain, were not consulted. Concerned Congress might sell the territory to Spain or France, roughly 50 frontiersmen met in Jonesboro and signed a document declaring independence from North Carolina. They named their state Franklin after Benjamin Franklin, hoping to win his support. John Sevier even wrote him a letter, but Franklin declined to get involved. Although the Franklin Territory received the backing of 7 states in Congress, it failed to reach the 2/3 majority necessary for statehood. Franklin operated anyway, running a parallel government alongside North Carolina's for several years. It fixed taxes and officers' salaries, opened courts, and incorporated new counties. With no currency, barter became the official economic system, with corn, tobacco, apple brandy, and animal skins all accepted as payment. Sevier's annual salary as governor was 1,000 deer skins. Franklin's weak economy eventually forced Sevier to approach the Spanish for aid. North Carolina, alarmed at the prospect of a Spanish client state on its border, arrested him. He was quickly freed by supporters, but the movement was finished. Franklin dissolved in 1789, and the territory eventually became the state of Tennessee in 1796, with Sevier as its first governor. The lost colony of Roanoke Appalachian theory. In 1587, over 100 English settlers established a colony on Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina. Their governor, John White, sailed back to England for supplies and was delayed 3 years by war. When he finally returned in 1590, he found the settlement looted and abandoned, with only the word Croatoan carved into a wooden post. No bodies, no signs of a fight, no explanation. The most widely accepted theory today is that the colonists split into multiple groups. Archaeological evidence uncovered in Bertie County, North Carolina, suggests some moved roughly 50 miles inland, while separate findings on Hatteras Island suggest others went to live among the Croatoan tribe. A hidden fort symbol discovered on a 1585 map under backlighting at the British Museum pointed researchers toward the inland site in the first place. The Appalachian connection comes through the Melungeons and the Lumbee people of North Carolina. One theory of Melungeon origins holds that they were descended from Roanoke survivors who were taken in by native tribes, intermarried, and over generations became the mixed-race communities that eventually pushed into the mountain interior as European settlers arrived on the coast. The Lumbee tribe maintains its own oral tradition of descent from the lost colonists, and several surnames shared between the Lumbee and the original Roanoke colony have been noted by researchers. None of it has been proven, and most scholars treat the Roanoke Appalachian connection as compelling folklore rather than settled history. So that ends the video. Thank you all for watching. Let me know your feedback in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video.